I have always believed that the sea remembers things more clearly than people do. Long after men have died, long after their empires have cracked and folded into dust, the sea holds on to the memory of their ambitions. It carries it in the restless shifting of the tides, in the salt that stings the air, in the low whisper of waves brushing against quiet shores. And when I think of the long, winding conflict between Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate, 144 years of rivalry stretched across generations, I do not imagine battlefields first. I imagine water, the Mediterranean, wide and glittering and merciless, acting as both bridge and battlefield, cradle and trap, the place where two worlds met again and again, unable to disentangle themselves. This was not a war in the traditional sense. There was no single campaign that defined it, no straightforward beginning or end, no moment when entire armies collided in a dramatic clash to rewrite history. Instead, it was something deeper and slower, like a pressure building beneath the Earth's surface, pushing upward over decades, until it created tremors, cracks, and finally, seismic shifts. It was a war made of tariffs, of embargoes, of ships navigating dangerous coasts under flickering lantern light, of ambassadors whispering half-truths in foreign courts, of fleets waiting for winds to turn in their favor. It was a war of shadows and tides, fought by merchants as much as by soldiers, and shaped by the inescapable pull of the world's most valuable goods. Long before cannons thundered across these waters, Venice rose from a tangle of swampy islands in the northern Adriatic, fragile at first, but stubborn in its will to survive. The Venetians learned quickly that the lagoon was both their shield and their prison. Land offered them nothing. The soil was poor, the terrain scattered, the threats from the mainland constant, but the sea, this they could master. And so they pushed their wooden hulls farther and farther, chasing opportunity into the heart of the Mediterranean. Over centuries, Venice built itself into an empire not by conquering land with armies, but by conquering routes with ships. Its power lay not in fortresses, but in contracts, not in kings, but in councils of merchants, not in swords, but in axes. Every Venetian's breath came from the east. Pepper fields in India, cinnamon groves in Ceylon, the long winding overland caravans that threaded through Arabia and the Levant, the silks that glowed like trapped dawn lithes, were not luxuries for Venice. They were lifeblood. Without trade, the lagoon would become nothing more than a scattering of wooden homes clinging to the mud. With trade, Venice could stand toe-to-toe with kingdoms larger, richer, and older than itself. That truth shaped every decision, every alliance, every carefully drafted treaty. Yet on the opposite shore of the Mediterranean, another power rose with equal determination and an entirely different path. The Mamluk Sultanate was not born from a place, but from a paradox. Men brought from the edges of the Islamic world as slaves, trained with brutal discipline, molded into elite soldiers, and eventually entrusted with protecting the very throne they would later seize. There is a strange strength in a society built on adversity. The Mamluks understood the harshness of life, the fragility of power, and the necessity of absolute control. From Cairo, brilliant, wealthy, and humming with scholars, artisans, and traders, the sultans shaped a realm that reached deep into Syria, Palestine, and the Red Sea. And with Cairo came Alexandria, the great port, the jewel of the eastern Mediterranean. Every ship from Venice that sought the riches of the east passed through Alexandria's harbors, through its customs houses, through the hands of its merchants, who were both gatekeepers and rivals. The Mamluks knew something Venice could never ignore. Whoever controlled these routes controlled the rhythm of the world. It was inevitable that these two powers, one born from the sea, the other born from the sword, would clash. But what makes this conflict remarkable is not simply that it lasted nearly a century and a half. It is that, for most of that time, Venice and the Mamluks needed each other as much as they distrusted each other. Trade bound them tightly. Venice depended on eastern spices, textiles, sugar, and dyes. The Mamluks depended on the customs revenue and the political leverage that came from controlling the final leg of the spice journey. It was a relationship of convenience balanced precariously on resentment, and in that unstable space, friction grew like friction always does, quietly, predictably, dangerously. Some decades passed in uneasy cooperation, Ships sailed, goods flowed, and diplomats exchanged cautiously polite letters. But beneath that surface, small incidents accumulated like grains of sand inside a clock slow, almost invisible, until one day they tipped the balance. A tariff increased. A Venetian merchant was arrested in Alexandria. A Mamluk official was accused of extorting foreign traders. Venetian sailors clashed with local workers at the docks. Each event a minor to trigger a real war, but each one part of a larger storm taking shape. And then there were the wider forces neither Venice nor the Mamluks fully controlled. Across the Mediterranean, Cyprus became a crucial point of tension. Positioned between east and west, rich with sugar plantations, and heavily influenced by Venetian families, Cyprus was viewed by the Mamluks as both a threat and a temptation. As Cyprus leaned more heavily toward Venetian influence, the Mamluks responded with increasingly aggressive moves, seeing in the island not just a political rival but a symbol of Venetian encroachment. The conflict over Cyprus would not only spark open war, but shape the course of the entire relationship. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, the pulse of everyday life reflected the rivalry more vividly than any diplomatic exchange. Sailors hauling ropes across crowded quays, merchants haggling over saffron and ginger, caravans delivering goods from the Red Sea. The weight of the empire's ambitions pressed on their shoulders. These ordinary people, far from the opulent halls of Venice Expands Palace or the Mamluk Citadel in Cairo, felt the consequences most directly. A delayed ship meant hunger. A tariff increase meant death. A diplomatic collapse meant war. And beyond the Mediterranean, a threat neither Venice nor the Mamluks could fully predict crept across the oceans. To the far west, the Portuguese were testing the limits of their navigational daring when they eventually rounded Africa and tapped into the Indian Ocean spice world. They would append the economic foundation upon which both Venice and the Mamluks had built their power. But that reckoning would come later, like a distant storm rolling over the horizon. For now, the stage was set. The sea was restless. The ambitions were sharpening. The mistrust was growing, and the world was changing faster than either side realized. As the years unfolded into decades, skirmishes turned into wars, treaties turned into betrayals, and generations grew up in the shadow of a rivalry that seemed as permanent as the tide. Venetian records tell of frustrated councils debating the unpredictable politics of Cairo. Mamluk chronicles describe the arrogance of foreign merchants who believed themselves above local law. But on both sides, there is a sense of weariness of two great powers locked in a struggle neither fully understood how to end. And eventually, the ending would not come from diplomacy or warfare, but from a third force rising in the north. The Ottomans would sweep across the region, breaking the Mamluk Sultanate in a single decisive conquest and rewriting the map of the Mediterranean. The war between Venice and the Mamluks would end not with victory, but with the Mamluk state itself collapsing under the weight of history as the next empire. But all of that lies ahead. For now, we return to the beginning of the long, twisting, salt-stained story of a rivalry that lasted 144 years. A story of merchants and sultans, of cities shaped by trade winds, of bitterness simmering beneath politeness, of ambitions stretching from the Adriatic to the Red Sea. A story where the sea itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next turn in the tide. When I first look back at the world that Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate inhabited, I am struck by how precarious everything truly was. We often imagine powerful states as if they were immovable giants, but the truth is that both Venice and the Mamluks lived in a state of constant vigilance. Their positions were impressive, yes, but they were also vulnerable. Fragile in ways that required constant maneuvering, negotiating, and defending. And when I retrace their footsteps, when I walk through the centuries of records, treaties, merchant logs, diplomatic letters, and chronicles, I find myself stepping into a world where survival depended on decisions made not just by kings and sultans, but by merchants, counting crates in the harbor, by soldiers guarding city gates, and by sailors who understood the winds better than they understood the politics shaping their voice. Venice, at the dawn of this long struggle, was already a paradox. It was a republic built on water, a state without fertile farmland, without mineral wealth, without the typical foundations that medieval kingdoms depended upon. Its power grew not from the soil but from salt water. In those labyrinthine canals and marshes, the Venetians crafted a political system that revolved entirely around commerce. Their government, an oligarchy of families who had risen through trade rather than military conquest, built a disciplined bureaucracy that rivaled any monarchy in Europe. They recorded everything. They audited everything. They debated every decision that might influence their lifeline, the flow of goods from the east. Their merchant fleets spread across the Mediterranean like a network of veins pumping wealth into the lagoon. Convoys sailed in tightly organized formations, each ship registered, inspected, and taxed to sustain the state. Venice had colonies, trading posts, and enclaves from Crete to Negroponte to Cyprus, placed strategically to secure routes rather than expand territory. To Venice, land was valuable only when it protected the sea. And all of this to fleets, the colonies, the bureaucracy existed for one purpose: to keep the flow of eastern goods moving. Without spices, without silk, without cotton from Egypt, without sugar from Cyprus, without pepper from India, Venice could not survive. Its people depended on trade for their livelihoods, and its ruling families depended on it for their power. But dependence breeds fear. To the leaders of Venice, the greatest threat was not a foreign army landing on their shores. It was the possibility that access to the east might be cut off. The Venetians lived with a constant awareness that their prosperity balanced on a fragile thread, and that thread ran directly through the territories of another great power, the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks had risen not through noble bloodlines or hereditary right, but through military discipline and merit. They were soldiers first, rulers second, and they governed with the hardened mentality of men who had had to fight for every status they ever achieved. Their empire encompassed Egypt, Syria, and the Red Sea ports that connected the Indian Ocean trade to the Mediterranean world. Cairo became a center of learning, of wealth, of culture, and of commerce. It was a city where caravans from Yemen, Ethiopia, and India funneled goods into markets filled with scents and colors the European travelers had never imagined. The Mamluks understood the value of controlling this trade. Customs taxes, caravan revenues, port duties. These formed the economic backbone of their empire. Every foreign merchant who entered Alexandria contributed to the financial strength of the state. Their control also stretched to the pilgrimage routes leading to Mecca and Medina, giving them not only wealth but prestige throughout the Islamic world. Their rule was strict, their hierarchy rigid, and their suspicion of external influence constant. They viewed Christian maritime powers Venice, Genoa, the Knights of Rhodes with a mix of necessity and distrust. They needed these traders, but they never fully accepted their presence. And so the relationship between Venice and the Mamluks took shape as something uniquely tense. It was not love, nor was it open hatred. It was interdependence. And interdependence is often the most volatile foundation two powers can build upon. Venice needed spices, textiles, dyes, sugar, and exotic goods to maintain its dominance. The Mamluks needed the customs taxes and the political leverage that arose from controlling the final gates of the long eastern routes. The treaties between them reflected that delicate balance. They regulated tariffs down to the smallest detail, outlined how sailors were to be treated, defined the rights of Venetian merchants, and provided guidelines for shipwrecks, debts, and disputes. Yet behind every clause, there lived distrust. Mass arrests of Venetian merchants could happen suddenly. Embargoes could be imposed without warning. Ships could be confiscated. Goods seized. Ransom demanded. The Venetians saw these actions as extortion or intimidation. The Mamluks saw them as tools of control over foreigners who they believed had to be kept in check, and so tension simmered. But why did tension evolve into war? Why did interdependence turn into confrontation? The answer, like so many in medieval geopolitics, lies in competition, pressure, and miscalculation. Both powers understood that controlling the Eastern Mediterranean meant controlling the global economy of the time. Venice had rivals in Europe, Genoa, Florence, and even the papacy itself at times. Every shift in allegiance, every papal decree, every Italian feud influenced Venice's relationship with the Mamluks. The papacy frequently forbade trade with Muslim states, threatening excommunication for Yet Venice repeatedly defied these orders, choosing survival over obedience. but disobedience earned suspicion. At the same time, the Mamluks had their own political pressures. Their rule depended on the stability of revenue, the loyalty of emirs, and the security of the Red Sea. They viewed any attempt by a foreign power to influence territories like Cyprus or Rhodes as a potential threat to their control over the trade arteries, and Cyprus became a particularly bitter point of contention. Venice's growing involvement on the island, politically, and eventually militarily alarmed the Mamluks, who saw Cyprus as a strategic point from which Christian powers could launch attacks on Alexandria or disrupt the Red Sea routes. The struggle for Cyprus became the spark that ignited full-scale war. But even that conflict was intertwined with broader forces shaping the world. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the Ottomans became an immediate, overwhelming presence on the political stage. Their rapid expansion pushed Venice into new conflicts and forced the Mamluks to fortify their positions. At the same time, Europe was changing. New monarchies rose, old rivalries intensified, and the balance of power shifted unpredictably. And then came a distant event that would shake everything: the arrival of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. When Portuguese ships established direct trade routes to India by sailing around Africa, they bypassed the entire eastern Mediterranean network. Overnight, the Mamluk economy faced an existential threat. Venice, equally dependent on the old system, felt the tremors. The spice trade that had sustained both powers for centuries was slowly slipping away to a new maritime world neither of them could control. By the early 16th century, this shift, combined with Ottoman military pressure, would break the Mamluk state entirely. The conflict between Venice and the Mamluks thus stretched far beyond simple naval skirmishes or territorial disputes. It was a story tied to the fates of entire continents. It unfolded across shifting diplomatic landscapes, economic dependencies, and global transformations that neither side could fully anticipate. It began with minor disputes in the late 14th century, intensified dramatically in the 5th-10th century with Cyprus at the center, and escalated into open warfare that carved itself into the archives of both empires. And ultimately, it ended not with a treaty between Venice and Cairo, but with the disappearance of the Mamluk Sultanate itself. In 1517, at the hands of the Ottomans, Venice survived but not untouched. The new world of global trade was already rewriting the rules, and the lagoon's merchant republic had to adapt to survive. As I step back from this sweeping landscape, I see a conflict shaped by commerce, fear, ambition, and the relentless pressure of history. Two powers bound together by the very trade that pushed them into rivalry. Two civilizations navigating a world where wealth and danger traveled on the same ships, and a war that did not feel like a single war at all, but like a long, uneven struggle shaped by the tides of an ever-changing sea. When I think of the earliest encounters between Venetians and the Mamluks, I imagine not the clash of armies, but the measured steps of diplomats, merchants, and envoys approaching each other with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Long before their relationship hardened into open hostility, there was a phase defined by slow, deliberate contact. Two worlds, separated by faith, language, and political structure, began to negotiate the terms on which they would coexist. The Venetians arrived as supplicants in some ways, as customers in others, and as potential threats in the eyes of Mamluk officials tasked with defending the Sultan's authority. The Mamluk state, in turn, appeared to Venetian observers as both rigid and strangely fluid, ruled by men who had climbed from slavery to command, men whose fierce discipline shaped every gesture of their political dealings. Their earliest exchanges were grounded in necessity. Venice sought to secure place in the flow of Eastern goods, and the Mamluks recognized that foreign merchants could be profitable, even useful. But necessity does not eliminate mistrust. The Venetians were Latin Christians, tied to a Europe that often spoke of crusade, of holy war, of converting or conquering the Islamic world. The Mamluks, who had recently crushed the last Crusade estates, viewed Westerners with suspicion. They remembered the sieges, the raids, the religious rhetoric that had filled earlier centuries with bloodshed. Yet these same rulers also inherited an economy tied to global trade networks, stretching from India to Ethiopia and deep into the Mediterranean. They needed a controlled space for foreign commerce. In this complicated atmosphere, Early Venetian envoys approached Cairo and Alexandria with diplomatic gestures that reflected both humility and ambition. They came bearing gifts, carefully chosen to avoid offense. They praised the Sultan's court as chroniclers often recorded, speaking of Cairo's wealth, its disciplined administration, and the justice of its rulers. But beneath these formalities, Venetian officials quietly pushed for what mattered most: guarantees of safety for their people, predictable taxes, and stable access to the markets. For the Mamluks, the question was not whether foreigners should be allowed to trade. It was on what terms, under what surveillance, and with what limits. The sultans relied deeply on customs revenue, yet allowing Latin Christians too much freedom could invite espionage, smuggling, or political interference. Every treaty, every clause, every handshake between Venetian envoys and Mamluk officials reflected this tension. The first formal agreements that historians trace between Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate appeared in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, at a time when the Mamluks were consolidating their control over Syria and Egypt, and Venice was emerging as a dominant maritime republic. These treaties did not yet speak of war or rivalry. They focused instead on establishing order among merchants who often found themselves caught between two legal systems, two languages, and two ways of viewing the world. The agreements granted Venetians specific rights in Alexandria, one of the greatest commercial hubs of the medieval world. They were allowed to rent houses in designated quarters. They could maintain a funduk, a kind of hostel warehouse, where goods were stored, inspected, and taxed. They could bring wine for their own consumption, but were forbidden from selling it openly. Their ships were inspected carefully, and cargo was recorded according to Mamluk regulations. Venetian merchants often described this process as strict, but not hostile. The Mamluk bureaucracy might have seemed overwhelming to newcomers, but it was also consistent. Within its rules, Venetians could operate with relative confidence. Damascus, too, opened specific channels for Venetian trade. Caravans arriving from the Red Sea, Yemen, Persia, and India passed through Damascus, making it a place where goods from distant worlds converged. The treaties allowed Venetian agents to purchase and transport these goods toward the Mediterranean, but they could not move freely beyond certain limits, and they were expected to respect local customs. One chronicler noted with mild frustration that even minor disagreements over a lost shipment, a disputed weight, or an unpaid tax could stall business for weeks until a qadi or official resolved the matter. This small frustration, however, also revealed something important. The structure worked. It was slow at times, but it functioned, and for a time, this fragile arrangement created a sense of peace. Not peace as we imagine it, but a working peace built on mutual economic benefit. The Venetians brought silver, timber, wool, metal tools, and other European products that the Mamluk economy could use. They returned with spices, sugar, cotton, silk, dyes, and countless other goods that became the lifeblood of Venetian commerce. Mamluk customs officials recorded every crate, every transaction, every tariff. Venetian ship captains prepared meticulous logs to present to their government upon return. Both sides watched the numbers, understanding instinctively that as long as the figures remained profitable, the fragile equilibrium held. But this equilibrium did not erase the cultural gap between them. The Venetians, with their republican councils and proud merchant families, often marveled at the Mamluk political system. They could not fully understand how men who had once been slaves could rise to rule an empire. They admired the strength of the Sultan's cavalry, the discipline of his emirs, and the order of his court, but they struggled to interpret the shifting alliances and factional rivalries within Mamluk politics. To the Venetians, the Sultanate sometimes seemed unpredictable, driven by internal power struggles that could overturn policy without warning. The Mamluks, on the other hand, viewed Venice with a blend of respect and wariness. They recognized the efficiency of the Venetian fleet, the wealth of the lagoon, and the influence Venice wielded among Christian states. But they remembered, too, the destructive power of crusading armies and the religious impetus behind European politics. Even Venice's insistence on neutrality did not entirely reassure them. They understood that the same republic that traded in Alexandria might one day be pressured by a pope or a coalition of European powers to turn its ships against the Muslim world. The Mamluks valued foreign merchants, but were not naive about their potential danger. This mutual wariness shaped the early treaties. Every right granted to Venetian traders was balanced by an obligation. Venetians could live in Alexandria, but only in certain areas. They could have their own priests, but they could not proselytize. They could transport goods freely after inspection, but they could not bring arms without explicit permission. They could settle disputes among themselves, but conflicts with local people fell under Mamluk jurisdiction. Venice accepted these terms because it had no choice. Its survival depended on cooperation. Despite the tension underlying the relationship, the first century of contact between the two powers unfolded with more stability than conflict. Trade flourished. Venetian merchants became familiar faces in the markets of Alexandria. Caravan leaders in Damascus learned to recognize Venetian agents by their accents and their careful bargaining. The Mamluk treasury benefited from customs fees that poured in year after year, reinforcing the state's financial base. But even in these early years, the seeds of future conflict were present. Every treaty contained points that could be interpreted differently by either side. Every economic fluctuation had the potential to provoke anger. A sudden rise in taxes could lead to Venetian protests. A dispute over a sailor or merchant accused of breaking a local law could escalate into a diplomatic crisis. And behind all of this, the broader world remained unstable. European calls for crusade never fully disappeared and could at any moment place Venice under pressure from Rome. The Mamluk Sultanate dealt with internal rivalries that might bring a new sultan to power with little interest in maintaining old agreements. The trade routes themselves were vulnerable to piracy, storms, and political disruption. Each side depended on the other's stability, and neither side could guarantee it. As Taipa said, the initial hesitations gave way to patterns of interaction that felt almost routine. Venice appointed officials specifically to manage relations with the Mamluk ports. The Sultan's government created standardized processes for foreign merchants. But routine did not mean safety. The relationship remained fundamentally transactional, and transactions can be broken. The early centuries of contact thus built a foundation that was strong enough to support commerce, but too weak to withstand the pressures of shifting power. It was a peace not based on trust, but on calculation. Both sides gained much from it, and both sides resented aspects of it. And as the world around them changed, these resentments grew. In the decades ahead, minor disputes would harden into full diplomatic confrontations. Arrests of Venetian merchants, accusations of espionage, and sudden embargoes would shake the fragile peace. The push for influence over Cyprus would further complicate matters, and new global forces, from the rise of the Ottomans to the arrival of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, would place unbearable strain on the old system that had held Venice and the Mamluks together. The early quiet years, when two worlds learned to tolerate each other across the shores of the Mediterranean, were only the beginning. The peace they built was real, but it was temporary, and the conflict that would follow would stretch across generations, reshaping both powers in ways neither could have predicted. From its humble beginnings on a collection of marshy islands, Venice had risen into a force that seemed to command the sea itself. By the late 14th century, the Republic was no longer a city of canals, and merchants it was a maritime empire. The Venetian fleet, built with unrivaled skill and maintained through meticulous bureaucracy, was the backbone of this transformation. Ships poured from the arsenal, the great shipbuilding complex that combined industrial precision with centuries of naval tradition. Here, timber was measured, holes fitted, and crews trained for voyages that stretched across the Mediterranean, into the Levant, and beyond. The arsenal was more than a shipyard. It was the beating heart of Venetian ambition, a place where commerce and military power were inseparable, and where the Republic's reach began to take tangible form across the sea. Venice's fleets were not mere instruments of war, they were tools of economic power. Convoys sailed regularly from the lagoon, carrying merchants, soldiers, and cargo destined for ports under Venetian control or influence. These convoys were carefully orchestrated, with experienced captains navigating treacherous waters, from the Adriatic to the Aegean, and onward to the ports of Alexandria and Damascus. Security was paramount. Pirates, privateers, and rival states constantly threatened these lifelines. Every convoy was a delicate balance of timing, protection, and diplomacy. The Republic invested heavily, understanding that control of the sea was essential not only for survival but for prosperity. For every spice, piece of silk, or sack of sugar depended on these fleets reaching their destinations intact. Colonial expansion mirrored maritime ambition. Venetian outposts dotted the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean, each serving as both a trading post and a defensive position. Crete, known as Candia, was the jewel of these holdings, offering a strategic base, fertile lands, and secure harbors. Negroponte, perched on the island of Euboea, served as a vital waypoint for convoys bound to the Levant, while smaller footholds near Cyprus allowed Venice to influence the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. These colonies were not static. They were hubs of commerce, diplomacy, and defense, often fortified with walls, garrisons, and watchtowers, reflecting the constant awareness that the sea was as contested as any battlefield on land. This assertive expansion did not go unnoticed. The Mamluks, whose power radiated from Cairo and Alexandria, watched Venetian growth with a mixture of caution and suspicion. To the sultans and emirs, Venice was both a vital trading partner and a potential threat. Venetian ships carrying European goods, silver, and spices represented wealth that could flow into Mamluk coffers, but they also symbolized the encroachment of a Christian maritime power into what is the Mamluks considered under their influence. Diplomats in Cairo recorded the cautious approach of Mamluk authorities, balancing the desire for trade with the need to assert control. Arrests, fines, and negotiations were not merely acts of hostilities. They were mechanisms for maintaining authority over a sea increasingly dominated by a foreign republic. Venice's assertiveness extended beyond commerce. The Republic invested in intelligence, mapping the coasts, monitoring shipping lanes, and keeping close watch on Ottoman, Genoese, and Mamluk activities. Economic imperatives drove much of this expansion. Venice depended on goods from the east, not only for wealth but for the very functioning of the Republic. Spices, sugar, textiles, and precious metals were the lifeblood of Venetian markets, sustaining artisans, merchants, and the complex machinery of the state itself. The colonies served as points of collection and redistribution, ensuring that goods flowed efficiently from the Levant and Red Sea to the lagoon city. Every port, every convoy, every contract was part of a larger system designed to extract maximum value while maintaining security. Venice's expansion was, in essence, the physical manifestation of its economic ambition, a strategy in which commerce and naval power were inseparable. Yet, with expansion came friction. Venice's growing presence near Cyprus, Crete, and other points of strategic interest created tension with the Mamluks. Each fortified outpost, each convoy, and each negotiation became a potential flashpoint. The Mamluks were acutely aware that Venetian influence could shift the balance of power, threatening their control over trade routes and customs revenue. In response, they enforced tariffs, monitored merchant activity, and at times imprisoned Venetian traders under suspicion of espionage or illicit dealings. Every act of Venetian assertiveness elicited a measured counter from Cairo, creating a persistent undercurrent of tension that would escalate over the decades. Military innovation underpinned Venetian confidence. The arsenal's shipwrights perfected the galley, a vessel optimized for speed, maneuverability, and combat in the confined waters of the Mediterranean. Crews were trained in both commerce and combat, understanding that survival required mastery of the sea as a battlefield. Venice also experimented with artillery, deploying cannons on ships to protect convoys and threaten coastal positions. This dual-purpose approach commerce, reinforced by military capability, ensured that Venetian expansion was not passive, but proactive, capable of asserting influence through both negotiation and force. The Republic's assertiveness was complemented by a sophisticated legal and administrative system. Governors, consuls, and magistrates oversaw colonies, trade agreements, and disputes. Venetian law provided mechanisms for resolving conflicts, both internally and with foreign powers. while bureaucratic oversight ensured that every voyage, cargo manifest and payment adhered to state protocols. This administrative rigor allowed Venice to maintain control over far-flung territories and navigate the complexities of interacting with rival powers, including the men. Every colony, every port, and every negotiation reflected a balance of ambition, discipline, and strategic foresight. Social and cultural elements reinforced expansion as well. Venice projected its identity through architecture, religious institutions, and urban planning in colonies. Churches, warehouses, and administrative centers symbolized Venetian authority and presence. At the same time, Venetian communities adapted to local contexts, engaging with local merchants, artisans, and officials. Venice's expansion was deliberate, systematic, and inexorably, drawing the Republic into the Mamluk orbit of concern and confrontation. From the arsenal to the colonies, from the convoys to the consuls, every element of the Republic's maritime strategy was designed to secure influence, wealth, and survival. And survival in a contested Mediterranean. The long shadow of this expansion would shape the coming conflicts, the cycles of negotiation, and the eventual flare-ups around Cyprus and Alexandria. Venice had become a power that could no longer be ignored, a maritime empire capable of influencing trade, diplomacy, and military calculations across the eastern Mediterranean. Cairo was the beating heart of the Mamluk Sultanate, and its rulers were not scions of noble houses, not heirs to ancestral thrones. They were former slaves, military elites purchased as boys from the steppes of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Turkic frontier, raised in barracks, trained with an obsession bordering on religious devotion, and molded into one of the most lethal fighting forces in the world. It was a capital not of birthright, but of sheer will and disciplined violence. A sultan held immense power, but he held it in a room full of men who had undergone the same training, survived the same crucibles, and carried the same scars. Each emir had once been a slave like him. Each possessed armies of their own, private households of trained Mamluks, who respected hierarchy only insofar as it aligned with their own survival. The palace in Cairo was not merely a seat of government, it was an arena, a place where coups, assassinations, and abrupt reversals of fortune were as common as ceremonial processions. Power in the Mamluk world moved quickly, but it never moved quietly. Yet for all their internal volatility, the Mamluks presided over a society of remarkable stability. In their courts, foreign merchants were not simply tolerated. They were managed with a precision that bordered on choreography. Yet what fascinates me most is not the wealth itself, but how the Mamluks weaponized it diplomatically. On one side were the Muslim states, the rising Ottomans, the fractured remnants of the Abbasid legitimacy sheltered in Cairo, the Beyliks and tribal confederations scattered across the Middle East. On the other side were the Christian powers of Europe, Venice, Genoa, Cyprus, the Crusader remnants, still clinging to the coastlines. The Mamluks played all of them masterfully. With Muslim rulers, they projected guardianship. They kept the balance unstable on purpose. Instability was leverage. With Christian states, they wielded commerce, like a weapon cutting off spiced axis when Venice stepped out of line, granting favors when Genoa proved useful, controlling the flow of pilgrim traffic to Jerusalem with almost theatrical care. They negotiated truces, ransomed prisoners, upheld treaties with a ruthlessly pragmatic approach that, paradoxically, gave them a reputation for reliability. This balancing act required a capital capable of absorbing immense cultural traffic. The beating of the Mamluk military drums mixed with the chanting of scholars and elite Persian poets, Syrian architects, Greek sailors, Yemeni traders all converged here. if you listened closely at night, past the murmurs of merchants, past the animal calls from the markets, past the Nile's slow churn, you could hear the distinctive rhythm of hoofbeats. The Mamluks, drilling, training, sharpening the skills that define their identity. Cairo's power stemmed from this duality. It was a metropolis built on the commerce of 1,000 cultures, yet governed by men forged in the strictest military traditions on earth. It was a city that welcomed the world, yet never surrendered to it. And as its influence rippled across continents, affecting European economies, shaping Islamic politics, and controlling the arteries of global trade, it became not just a place, but a thesis. Strength could come from the margins. Discipline could replace aristocracy, and a desert empire could shape the fate of nations that had never even seen the Nile. In Cairo's rise, you see the central truth of the medieval Mediterranean. Power was no longer fixed, no longer predictable. It flowed like the trade routes themselves, constantly shifting, crossing boundaries, changing hands. And in this shifting world, the Mamluks of Cairo stood not merely as rulers, but as arbiters. The ones who understood that an empire in the desert must draw its strength from both the sword and the ledger book. And as the centuries unfolded, that balance between force and diplomacy, between wealth and warfare, would bring Cairo into the broader struggles shaping the region. For the desert never remained still, and neither would the powers that watched Cairo with envy, admiration, and fear. If the relationship between Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate had a beginning, it also had an inevitable fracture point. You could feel the tension simmering long before anything snapped out. Written unease that crept into merchant correspondences, diplomatic letters, and the quiet complaints exchanged in the back rooms of warehouses along the Grand Canal. For decades, the bond between the Lagoon Republic and the desert powerhouse had been built on mutual dependence. Venice needed the Mamluk trade routes. The Mamluks needed Venetian ships, Venetian silver, and Venetian willingness to serve as Europe's primary gateway to the East. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The sands around Cairo and the waters around Venice were beginning to grind against each other, not with a sudden clash, but with a slow, deliberate friction. It began, as many political rifts do, with something deceptively mundane. Tariffs, a small change in customs policy in Alexandria, or a newly enforced duty on spices in Damascus, could ripple all the way back to the Rialto markets. Venetian traders were accustomed to navigating costs. They thrived on tight margins and tight control, but they were not accustomed to unpredictability. When Mamluk officials began recalculating customs dues more aggressively, demanding new documentation, and inserting additional layers of taxation, it wasn't just a financial inconvenience. It felt like a warning. To Cairo, however, these changes were not provocations. They were ways to regulate an increasingly unruly marketplace and assert state control over a trade network that was expanding faster than anyone had anticipated. The Red Sea outlets were teeming with traffic. Goods from India and Africa were pouring in with greater volume, and Venice, increasingly bold in its demands, seemed to believe the Mamluks existed to grease the wheels of its commercial empire. Mamluk bureaucrats saw the tariff adjustments as a way to ensure that Cairo, not Venice, captured the lion's share of the profit. But merchants have long memories and short tempers. Venetian traders whispered among themselves that the Mamluks were squeezing them for no reason, or worse, preparing to replace them with rivals from Genoa. It didn't even matter that Cairo was applying many of the same rules to other foreigners. The Venetians took it personally, and in the mercantile world, a perceived insult can be more dangerous than a real one. Customs officials grew stricter. Confiscations became more common. A missing document or a mislabeled crate could lead to delays so long that entire cargoes spoiled in the desert heat. The bureaucratic machine of the Mamluk Sultanate, usually efficient and razor-precise, felt suddenly unpredictable. Venetian merchants wrote home, describing Alexandria's port not as a crossroads of the world, but as a place where even a minor customs dispute could escalate into a political incident. And then came the imprisonments. no one agrees who started the practice. Venetian accounts insist that the Mamluk authorities, frustrated with mounting disputes, began detaining merchants at random using imprisonment as leverage in negotiations. Mamluk chronicles, however, paint a different picture. Venetian traders had been flouting customs law, smuggling goods, and bribing officials, and detention was simply the legal consequence. What matters is not who was right. What matters is how it felt. For the traders who saw their compatriots dragged off to Mamluk holding cells, often without explanation, the message was unmistakable. In the labyrinthine streets of Cairo, imprisonment was not always the medieval nightmare one might envision. A detainee might spend his days in a guarded compound rather than a dungeon, receiving food from local patrons or fellow merchants. But prestige mattered more than physical conditions. When a Venetian merchante man who considered himself the embodiment of a proud maritime republic found himself locked away by men he viewed as foreign, the humiliation was profound, and humiliation, especially when mixed with commerce and politics, breeds anger. But the Mamluks felt their own kind of insult. They viewed Venetian defiance as a direct challenge to their sovereignty. For a merchant to quarrel with a customs official was to quarrel with the Sultanate itself. Worse still, rumors began circulating in Cairo that Venice was not merely complaining, it was spying. The accusations of espionage came from all directions. Mamluk officials suspected that Venetian consuls were mapping harbors, gathering information on troop movements, or tracking diplomatic alliances. Venice, after all, was not merely a trading republic. It was a naval power with the capacity to project force far beyond its size. And the Mamluks, surrounded by rivals on multiple fronts, could not afford to be complacent. If they sensed a threat, they acted. Meanwhile, in Venice, the suspicions ran just as hot. Senators on the Great Council debated whether the Mamluks were feeding intelligence to Genoa or Cyprus, perhaps hoping to undermine Venetian dominance. Some even claimed that Cairo was deliberately sabotaging Venetian cargoes, misreporting weights and measures to weaken their economic standing. None of these accusations were ever proven. But proof was irrelevant. Emotion had overtaken logic, and once espionage entered the conversation, trust evaporated. Diplomats attempted to patch the growing cracks. Letters traveled across the Mediterranean laden with apologies, clarifications, and carefully worded assurances. Cairo dispatched envoys to Venice insisting that no hostile policy was intended. Venice sent its own representatives to explain that the merchants' complaints were not a sign of rebellion, but simply the predictable frustrations of men navigating a foreign system. Yet every attempt at reconciliation seemed to deepen the wound. The problem wasn't the policies themselves, it was the meaning behind them. Venice interpreted every tariff adjustment as a provocation. Cairo interpreted every Venetian protest as arrogance, even when both sides meant to reduce tension. Their tone, their timing, their assumptions betrayed an underlying resentment. Neither could fully express. They were too dependent on each other to break ties, yet too proud to admit the dependence openly. One moment stands out: a diplomatic summit in Cairo where Venetian representatives requested that imprisoned merchants be released immediately as a gesture of goodwill. The Mamluk officials agreed, but added a condition. Venice needed to publicly acknowledge that its merchants had broken the law. The delegation was horrified. From their perspective, admitting guilt would set a dangerous precedent, one that could haunt Venetian commerce for generations. The Mamluks were equally stunned by Venice's refusal. How could the Republic demand mercy without accepting responsibility? To them, the Venetian position was not merely unreasonable. It was insulting to the authority of the Sultan. The meeting ended with polite smiles and formal courtesies, but beneath the surface, both sides walked away, more convinced of the other's duplicity. And so the rifts widened. Trade continued, for the arteries of the Mediterranean could not be easily surveyed, but it carried an air of suspicion. A Venetian ship docking in Alexandria's harbor did so with trepidation. A Mamluk customs officer inspecting a cargo of pepper did so with an extra layer of scrutiny. A consul writing a report to Venice did so with growing cynicism. Neither side wished for war. Neither side could afford open conflict. Yet both were drifting toward a confrontation they believed the other was provoking. What makes this period so striking is not the drama of a single event, but the cumulative weight of minor grievances. A new tariff here, a detained merchant there, a rumor whispered in a bazaar, a misinterpreted letter, a snub during a ceremonial greeting. Each incident, small, even forgettable on its own. Batojeter. They created a climate where every action was viewed through the lens of suspicion. This is how relationships collapse in history, not with a single blow, but with the slow accumulation of doubts. Venice and Cairo still needed each other desperately, yet each step they took toward reconciliation seemed to confirm what the other feared most. The Mamluks believed Venice was testing their authority. Venice believed Cairo was tightening a noose around its commerce. Neither could break free without destroying themselves, so they continued the dance, inching ever closer to the edge. By the time the first overt hostilities arrived, the damage had already been done. The foundation of trust was cracked, the air thick with resentment, and the political landscape primed for conflict. What began as tariff disputes and a few imprisonments had evolved into something far deeper, a mutual belief that the other side was acting in bad faith. This was the first real Brechta moment when cooperation began its slide into antagonism. And though the rift had not yet become a chasm, the path toward wider conflict was already visible, carved by the very forces that once bound these two powers together. In the late medieval world, spices were not mere flavorings. They were currency, status, and survival wrapped into one. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger. These were more than ingredients for cooking. They were symbols of wealth, markers of social standing, and, in the hands of merchants, instruments of power. In Venice, every family that mattered had a stake in the spice trade. A single ship laden with pepper from India could enrich a noble house for years, fund fleets, pay mercenaries, and elevate a merchant family to influence rivaling that of minor princes. Spices were more than commodities. They were the lifeblood of the Lagoon Republic. Venice's dependence on Eastern luxuries shaped everything. The city-state's coffers were fueled by goods that passed first through Cairo, then across the Mediterranean into Venetian warehouses. Without spices, without sugar from Cyprus, without silks from Damascus or India, Venice would shrink into an ordinary maritime town, remarkable only for its canals. Its fleets, meticulously maintained and strategically deployed, existed to ensure that the flow of goods continued uninterrupted. On the other side of the Mediterranean, the Mamluks recognized the centrality of this trade. Their power, though rooted in military discipline, depended as much on commerce as on cavalry. Alexandria and the Red Sea ports were the arteries through which wealth coursed into Cairo. This monopoly was not a passive arrangement. It was enforced rigorously. Pepper alone, often referred to as black gold, had multiple functions. It preserved meat, masked the taste of imperfect storage, demonstrated wealth, and even had supposed medicinal properties. Mamluk officials, for their part, understood the leverage they held. Every tariff adjustment, every port regulation, every decision about which merchant houses to favor or punish was a statement of control. The Sultanate could make trade profitable or punitive, and they did not hesitate to use that authority. But this control required constant vigilance. Smugglers tried to bypass ports. European agents attempted to influence local governors. Rival Muslim powers tested the limits of alliances. The Red Sea routes were long, dangerous, and constantly under threat from both nature and politics. For the Mamluks, losing control or even a perceived loss of control over trade routes could undermine political authority, embolden rivals, and destabilize the Sultanate's fragile hierarchy. Even minor disruptions in this cycle could have ripple effects. A ship delayed by bad weather in the Red Sea could provoke months of negotiation in Cairo. A customs dispute over a batch of cloves could result in the temporary detention of merchants and a flurry of complaints to the Venetian Senate. The Mamluks needed Venetian compliance, silver, and the economic vitality that European demand produced. Each side wielded power, yet each relied on the other in ways neither could fully eliminate. This delicate equilibrium, maintained for decades, eventually eroded as the value of spices increased and European markets expanded. Venice's ambitions grew, and the Mamluks' insistence on control hardened. The Red Sea trade became a flashpoint, a daily negotiation of authority, wealth, and survival. Each shipment carried more than goods. It carried political messages, financial leverage, and the weight of centuries of history. And every failure to navigate these complexities sowed the seeds for deeper conflict. Both understood, instinctively, that the spice trade was more than commerce. It was a measure of power, a battlefield in its own right. Spices could enrich, empower, and elevate. They could also enrage, destabilize, and provoke. For Venice, pepper and cinnamon were instruments of survival and empire building. For the Mamluks, they were tools of authority, control, and diplomacy. The problem of spices, then, was not a single event or dispute. It was a continuous tension, a web of interdependence fraught with peril, shaping the course of a 144-year rivalry that would stretch across generations and continents. the first confrontations that would eventually draw both Venice and the Mamluks into open conflict across decades and generations, shaping history in ways that neither side could yet fully imagine. For a Venetian envoy, entering Cairo was akin to stepping onto a chessboard where every piece moved with intention, and every misstep could prove fatal. The city itself was vast, bustling, and unyielding. Merchants crowded the narrow streets of bazaars. Water carriers navigated canals that ran like veins through the urban sprawl, and minarets punctuated the skyline with reminders of faith and power. Yet beneath the vibrant chaos lay a strict hierarchy that governed access to the most vital prize. The Sultan himself, Venice, dependent on Eastern trade for its survival, understood that the only path to influence was through careful diplomacy, but in Cairo, diplomacy was never simple. The first challenge was understanding the asterisk. Mamluk court. Asterisk. Unlike European courts with hereditary kings and predictable rituals, the Mamluk Sultanate was a web of military elites, bureaucrats, and religious authorities. The Sultan's power was immense, but it was balanced by the ambitions and rivalries of his emir. Every action had to be measured, every word weighed. Venetian envoys quickly learned that personal access to the Sultan was controlled by layers of intermediaries, a hierarchy of scribes, secretaries, chamberlains, and lesser officials who determined who could enter, when, and for what purpose. A letter sent without proper channels might never reach the ruler. A gift presented to the wrong official could be dismissed or worse, insult the Sultan. To navigate this maze, Venetian diplomats relied on patience, observation, and, often, ingenuity. They carried letters of introduction, lavish gifts, and carefully prepared arguments. Their instructions were precise. Avoid offense, present grievances politely, and remember that every gesture, how a hand was extended, how a head was bowed, how a word was chosen, could be interpreted politically. Mistakes could be costly. One envoy, writing years later, described waiting in Cairo's court for days, carefully observing the rhythm of audience schedules, noting which officials spoke first, who relayed messages, and how petitions were prioritized. In that environment, diplomacy was as much performance as negotiation, yet even meticulous planning could not overcome the asterisk. Scribes held disproportionate power, recording petitions, deciding who would gain the Sultan's attention, and sometimes modifying documents to reflect the court's interpretation. A complaint about a customs dispute could be delayed for months, subtly reframed, or routed to the wrong office, forcing envoys to repeat requests, subit bribus, or seek alternative channels. For Venetians, accustomed to the structured legalism of the Republic, these delays were frustrating, but they also offered insight into the delicate balancing act that defined Mamluk governance. Everything in Cairo required negotiation, not just with the Sultan, but with the entire network of officials who enforced his authority. Within this context, secret negotiations became a critical tool. Venetian envoys often met privately with sympathetic emirs, minor officials, or influential scribes to resolve disputes quietly, away from the public eye. Fines could be reduced, shipments released, and prisoners liberated if the right intermediaries were persuaded. These meetings required discretion, subtlety, and sometimes a willingness to pay substantial sums in ransom or bribes. Venice aware that formal petitions alone were insufficient, cultivated a culture of behind-the-scenes negotiation. The Republic recognized that survival in Cairo depended on skillful maneuvering, not brute force. This blend of public diplomacy and private negotiation was central to the Venetian approach. Envoys presented petitions, officially, adhering to court etiquette, while simultaneously exploring unofficial channels to achieve results. A shipment detained in Alexandria might be discussed in formal letters to the Sultan, while the envoys simultaneously met with a well-placed clerk who could expedite the release. Envoys learned quickly that gestures interpreted as polite in Venice might be read as threatening or arrogant in Cairo. Misreading a gesture could provoke delays, increased fines, or the temporary suspension of trade rights. Ransom payments became a regular component of this delicate dance. Merchants detained for alleged violations often depended on envoys to secure their release. These payments were not merely monetary. They were signals of respect and acknowledgement of Mamluk authority. Venice accepted these obligations because it had no alternative letting a merchant languish in prison. Risked both financial loss and political embarrassment. Yet the process also reinforced the imbalance in the relationship. Each payment reminded Venice that access to trade depended on Mamluk discretion, and each delay reminded the Mamluks of the Republic's dependence. Over time, these negotiations accumulated into a complex tapestry of diplomacy, threats, and concessions. Venetian envoys became adept at reading the subtleties of Cairo's court, who had influence, who was susceptible to persuasion, which emirs could be courted with gifts, and which officials were immovable. Every visit, every petition, every fine negotiated or paid contributed to a delicate equilibrium, one that could be disrupted by a single misstep, a harsh word, or an overreach by either side. The subtle threats of naval retaliation played a psychological role as well. While Venetian ships could not sail into the heart of Cairo, their presence in the eastern Mediterranean served as a constant reminder of the Republic's capacity for projection. Envoys used this leverage carefully. Diplomats learned that every advantage, however minor, could be leveraged to extract concessions, shape behavior, and maintain dominance. In this environment, diplomacy was less a matter of friendship than of mutual calculation, a game played in shadows. By the end of the 15th century, the role of Venetian envoys had evolved from simple intermediaries to strategic operators. They carried the knowledge of past conflicts, the weight of commercial interests, and the subtle art of persuasion. They understood that every interaction with the Mamluk bureaucracy, every petition, every gift, every carefully crafted warning could ripple across decades, influencing trade, politics, and the balance of power. Their work was exhausting, precise, and constant. Each envoy's journey was not merely diplomatic. It was existential, a tightrope walk above the swirling currents of Mediterranean politics, economics, and military potential. The lessons learned in these hostile courts would resonate for generations. They revealed the intricate interplay of commerce and politics, the power of perception, and the fragility of peace maintained through mutual dependence and subtle coercion. Venetian envoys learned that survival and profit depended on understanding the rules of a system that valued hierarchy, loyalty, and discipline above all. The Mamluks learned that Venice was neither naive nor easily intimidated, and that controlling access to trade required both firmness and finesse. In the end, diplomacy in Cairo was not a ceremonial exercise. It was a battlefield in miniature. Envoys, scribes, bureaucrats, and naval commanders each played a part in shaping the outcomes of trade, influence, and even survival. Every letter written, every audience attended, and every negotiation conducted carried the weight of the broader conflict between Venice and the Mamluks, foreshadowing the larger struggles that would soon erupt into open confrontation. It was a world where words carried consequences as sharp as any sword, where patience could be as deadly as aggression, and where the most ordinary of transactions, the release of a detained merchant, the adjustment of a fine, the delivery of a shipment, could define the fortunes of empires. Trade had always been the quiet engine of Venice's wealth, but as the 15th century progressed, commerce alone could no longer safeguard the Republic's interests. The simmering tension with the Mamluks began to manifest not only in letters, fines, and secret negotiations. But in a subtler, more insidious form of economic warfare, ships became symbols of power. Silver became leverage, and the Mediterranean itself transformed into a battlefield where dominance was measured as much by the reach of one's fleet as by the weight of one's coin. Venice, acutely aware of its dependence on spices, sugar, and other Eastern luxuries, responded with deliberate strategy. The Republic's naval tradition, centuries old, was honed in the shallow lagoons, in the Adriatic and along the Anatolian coast. But as disputes with the Mamluks intensified, Venice expanded its fleets, constructing galleys that were faster, sturdier, and better armed than ever before. These vessels were not only designed for transport, they were floating fortresses, capable of projecting Venetian power across the Mediterranean, intimidating rivals, and protecting vital trade routes. Every ship built, every oar reinforced, every cannon installed was a statement. Venice would not be constrained, nor would it allow any foreign power to dictate its commerce. Economic warfare was not always open. The Venetians wielded tariffs, shipping regulations, and controlled access to European markets as tools to press Cairo. Delays in payment, strategic monopolies over certain trade goods, and subtle manipulation of credit allowed Venice to influence the flow of commerce without firing a shot. Yet the fleet remained the ultimate insurance, a visible, tangible reminder that the Republic had the means to escalate if diplomacy failed. The Mamluks, meanwhile, faced a unique challenge. Egypt and Syria were inland empires with centuries of overland dominance, but naval power had never been their traditional strength. Their command of the Red Sea trade allowed them to regulate commerce, levy taxes, and assert authority over the flow of Eastern goods. But open confrontation with Venice required a maritime capacity they had yet to fully develop. Nevertheless, ambitious sultans and emirs recognized that controlling the sea lanes was no longer optional. They embarked on an unprecedented effort to construct ships capable of matching, at least in part, Venetian vessels, using local timber, imported knowledge from European shipwrights, and the forced labor of coastal populations. They attempted to build fleets that could patrol the Red Sea, protect their ports, and challenge Venetian influence. The technological and logistical limitations, however, were significant. Mediterranean shipbuilding relied on centuries of accumulated expertise, specialized materials, and a workforce attuned to naval warfare. The Mamluks, while disciplined and resourceful, struggled to create a fleet that could rival Venice's centuries-old experience. Their galleys were often heavier, slower, and less maneuverable, and their crews, though skilled in some maritime tasks, lacked the integrated training of Venetian rowers, sailors, and marines. Yet even an imperfect fleet served a purpose. It allowed the Sultanate to assert authority, project presence along critical Red Sea ports, and signaled to Europe that Cairo would not be passive in protecting its economic interests. Rivalry inevitably extended beyond mere economics. The **Red Sea and the Aegean *** became zones of constant tension, where Venetian and Mamluk interests collided in subtle confrontations. A Venetian galley entering the Levantine waters faced inspections, unpredictable harbor fees, and sometimes the silent hostility of Mamluk-controlled ports. Conversely, the appearance of a Mamluk ship in the eastern Mediterranean, a rare but deliberate maneuver, served as a warning. The Sultanate had a hand in the waters Venice considered its own. Even without direct combat, these interactions fostered an atmosphere of suspicion, preparation, and calculation. Cairo and Venice understood that dominance in this period required both financial might and naval capability. Venice invested heavily in its arsenal, turning shipyards into centers of innovation and production, while the Mamluks poured resources into constructing a fleet and securing coastal defenses. Each side monitored the other's activities, gathering intelligence, observing ship movements, and recording innovations. Economic success became inseparable from military readiness, a lesson that reshaped strategic priorities on both shores. The contest was also a reflection of global shifts. European demand for spices, sugar, and luxury textiles had never been higher, and each shipment represented immense wealth. Venice's fleets ensured that the Republic could control distribution across the Mediterranean, reinforcing political influence along trade networks from Constantinople to Genoa. The Mamluks, aware that every lost shipment diminished Cairo's power, leveraged their ports, tariffs, and emerging naval presence to assert authority over the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. In this way, the struggle for commerce evolved into a struggle for strategic control, where success or failure could determine the prosperity or even survival of states. Venetian diplomacy intertwined seamlessly with naval power. Envoys communicated the Republic's position, while ships patrolled the waters, ready to act if negotiation failed. The presence of Venice's fleet was as much a psychological instrument as a physical one, reinforcing leverage during delicate trade disputes, or in the face of Mamluk assertiveness. Mamluk officials, in turn, recognized that direct confrontation was costly, but indirect pressure control over ports, inspections, and terrace allowed them to maintain influence without engaging in open warfare. The interplay of ships and silver created a tense equilibrium, fragile and susceptible to disruption. Yet disruption was inevitable. Minor skirmishes, disputes over cargo, or incidents in harbors could escalate quickly when both sides were heavily invested in the same strategic zones. A delayed ship, a miscommunicated order, or a perceived insult at port could provoke months of negotiation, bribe exchanges, and subtle displays of force. The competition between Venice and the Mamluks was not just about wealth. It was about prestige, authority, and reputation. Both powers understood that in a world governed by maritime trade, even a single victory or defeat in the Aegean or Red Sea could have implications for decades of policy and commerce. In addition to naval and economic maneuvering, both powers relied on intelligence. Venetian merchants and spies monitored Red Sea traffic, recorded Mamluk port activity, and reported back on ship movements, harbor fortifications, and logistical arrangements. The Mamluks, for their part, deployed informants in key ports, observed European activity, and kept meticulous records of foreign trade. Every action on the water was shadowed by awareness of the other's capabilities and intentions. Commerce, diplomacy, and naval presence converged into a multi-layered contest. By the mid-15th century, the stage was set for conflict. Venice's expanding fleet and its determination to secure access to spices, sugar, and textiles collided with the Mamluks' drive to protect revenue, assert sovereignty, and establish a nascent naval presence. The Red Sea became a zone of tension. The Aegean, a theater of strategic signaling, and every shipment, every galley, every levy of silver carried consequences far beyond its immediate value. The rivalry had outgrown the boundaries of customs disputes and diplomatic wrangling. It had become a contest in which wealth, power, and naval strength were inseparable and in which miscalculation could lead to open confrontation. Even as Venice refined its galleys, trained its crews, and expanded arsenals, the Mamluks persisted, learning, adapting, and attempting to match Venetian skill. Neither side sought war openly, yet the conditions were increasingly aligned for escalation. The contest of ships and silver was not merely a matter of economics, it was the prelude to centuries of conflict. A dance of diplomacy and force that would define the relationship between these two Mediterranean powers. For generations, the Red Sea, the Levantine coast, and the islands of the Aegean became a network of tension points, watched closely by envoys, merchants, and naval commanders alike. Every new tariff, every shipment of goods, every patrol along the coastline was both a test and a warning. Venice and the Mamluks were caught in a cycle of interdependence and rivalry, where the promise of profit and the threat of loss existed side by side. Each side recognized that control of the seas meant control of trade, and control of trade meant influence across the Mediterranean and beyond. This was the world in which the next phase of the 144-year struggle would unfold. Ships no longer carried only spices, they carried messages of intent, warnings of consequence, and symbols of prestige. Silver no longer represented only profit, it represented leverage, influence, and the capacity to enforce policy. The stage was set, and the players were ready. The seas themselves had become the arena of power, and neither Venice nor the Mamluks could ignore the implications of every voyage, every ship, every coin. The contest of ships and silver was not merely a prelude. It was a defining feature of the rivalry, a lens through which all subsequent conflicts, negotiations, and confrontations would be measured. It revealed the fragile intersection of commerce, diplomacy, and military capability, and it underscored a simple truth. In the medieval Mediterranean, wealth was inseparable from power, and power was inseparable from the ability to navigate both land and sea. The year 1453 marked a turning point in the Mediterranean world, a year when the maps of power were redrawn overnight. Constantinople, the fabled city bridging Europe and Asia, fell to the Ottomans under Sultan Mehmed II, and with its fall, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean shifted irrevocably. For Venice, the consequences were immediate and chilling. The city had long relied on Byzantium as a buffer against Islamic powers. Its fleets could navigate the Aegean with relative security, knowing that Constantinople and its walls provided a defensive shield against the ambitions of expanding empires. That shield had crumbled. Venice's loss was not merely strategic, it was psychological. The city had watched, often with cautious diplomacy, as Constantinople endured repeated threats over centuries, yet to see the once impenetrable walls breached, to witness the Byzantine emperor's final hours, to understand that the Ottomans now controlled the gateway to the Black Sea and the Bosporus, was a shock to Venetian sensibilities. The Republic suddenly faced a new reality, one in which trade, diplomacy, and naval power alone might not suffice. The Ottomans were disciplined, ambitious, and technologically advanced, possessing artillery, disciplined infantry, and a vision for expansion that threatened every Mediterranean player. Cairo, too, observed the fall of Constantinople with unease. The Mamluk Sultanate had long regarded the Ottomans with suspicion, but now that suspicion transformed into tangible fear. The Ottomans were not simply another rival. They were a rising power with the capability to dominate the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and eventually the Red Sea trade routes. Mamluk officials began to rethink their strategies, questioning whether their navy, limited in experience and capacity, could defend ports and trade lanes against the disciplined fleets of the Ottoman navy. Strategic calculations shifted overnight, and every decision from Alexandria to Damascus carried the shadow of a new, formidable neighbor. For Venice, the Ottoman Conquest created a dual problem. On one hand, the Republic lost a crucial ally in Byzantium. On the other, it now faced an empire whose ambitions overlapped with Venetian trade routes. The Black Sea, once a relatively secure hinterland for Venetian commerce, became contested territory. The Aegean, dotted with islands and Venetian possessions, was suddenly under the gaze of a power capable of launching campaigns across both land and sea. Even routine diplomatic missions to the Mamluks became more complicated. Every envoy carried not only the weight of trade negotiations, but also the implicit awareness that the Ottoman Empire was an expanding shadow on the horizon. Both Venice and Cairo quietly began to asterisk brace for a more dangerous world. In Venice, the arsenal ramped up construction. Stocks of armaments were expanded, and fleets were repositioned. Generals and senators debated contingency plans, weighing the defense of the Adriatic, the Aegean, and the eastern Mediterranean against the potential threat of Ottoman aggression. The Republic, while still focused on the spice trade and its relationship with the Mamluks, now understood that commerce alone might not be enough to preserve security and sovereignty. Every decision, every treaty, every shipment carried the latent calculus of risk posed by the Ottomans. In Cairo, Mamluk planners and emirs convened with urgency. The Sultanate's traditional approach, relying on Red Sea control, fortifications, and diplomacy with foreign powers, now seemed precarious. Rumors of Ottoman naval capabilities, intelligence on their military innovations, and reports of conquests along Anatolia's coastlines reached Cairo, reinforcing the reality that future conflict was almost inevitable. While Venice might still remain a commercial partner, the greater challenge was preparing for a power whose ambitions could threaten both trade and territory. The Mamluks understood that their earlier confidence in controlling access to spices, sugar, and luxury goods could be tested by a military force far larger and more disciplined than any European fleet. The fall of Constantinople also altered the asterisk psychology of Venetian-Mamluk relations. Previously, their disputes had unfolded in a relatively stable Mediterranean, where power was distributed among multiple states, and no single empire could dominate completely. Now, the equilibrium was disrupted. Venice and the Mamluks both recognized the Ottomans as a shared threat, yet that recognition did not automatically foster alliance or trust. Each side measured the other's loyalty, assessed intentions, and recalibrated expectations. Economic and diplomatic interactions continued, but they now occurred under the shadow of an empire whose presence demanded vigilance, preparedness, and sometimes cautious suspicion. Trade itself was affected. The Ottomans controlled the passage between the Aegean and the Black Sea, influencing the flow of grain, timber, and other essential commodities. Venetian merchants had to consider new tolls, altered routes, and the potential for Ottoman interference. Mamluk officials, already attuned to Venice's assertiveness, now had to evaluate how much leverage they could exercise without provoking conflict in a region that could soon be militarized by a third power. The spices that had been the focus of rivalry, the pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and sugar were suddenly part of a larger strategic calculation. Every shipment, every negotiation, and every voyage now intersected with the shifting tectonics of Mediterranean geopolitics. Despite the looming threat, both powers maintained a careful balance. Venice continued to engage the Mamluks diplomatically, ensuring trade routes remained open, customs disputes were managed, and imprisoned merchants were released. Cairo continued to levy tariffs, inspect shipments, and assert authority over the Red Sea, while quietly assessing Ottoman movements. Both sides had learned the value of restraint, subtlety, and negotiation over open confrontation lessons, forged over decades of rivalry. Now tested by the changing landscape of regional power, Venetian envoys adapted their strategies to this new reality. Reports from Cairo now included detailed assessments of Ottoman military strength, port fortifications, and potential threats to shipping. Negotiations were framed not only in terms of commerce, but also in the context of security and strategic alignment. Similarly, Mamluk officials considered Venice's naval capacity in light of the Ottoman threat. Cooperation, or at least non-confrontation, became a pragmatic priority, even as underlying mistrust persisted. The fall of Constantinople also reverberated in the minds of ordinary people. Merchants, sailors, and caravan workers sensed the shifting tides. Letters from Venetian captains described ports fortified in anticipation of conflict. Chronicles from Cairo note increased vigilance along coastal towns and the recruitment of crews for newly constructed ships. The news of Constantinople's fall traveled slowly, yet its psychological impact was immediate. The Mediterranean, once a familiar expanse of commerce and navigation, had become a stage for greater uncertainty. This moment, the collapse of Byzantium and the rise of the Ottomans did not immediately dissolve Venetian-Mamluk tensions, nor did it end trade disputes. Instead, it transformed the context. Previous conflicts over tariffs, imprisoned merchants, and customs fines were now overlaid with the awareness that a far larger, more organized, and militarily potent power lurked just across the horizon. Every action, whether a minor negotiation in Alexandria or the dispatch of a galley to Cyprus, carried the implicit question: how will this appear to the Ottomans? Both Venice and Cairo understood that the world had changed. The balance of power that had allowed them to engage in subtle rivalries without existential risk no longer existed. They would continue to negotiate, trade, and maneuver, but the stakes had grown immeasurably. The Mediterranean was no longer a space of predictable interaction. It had become a theater in which the ambitions of the Ottomans intersected with centuries of commerce, diplomacy, and rivalry. In the wake of 1453, both states quietly prepared for a future in which survival would require more than skillful negotiation. Venice reinforced its fleets, stocked arsenals, and re-evaluated alliances. The Mamluks sought to strengthen naval capacity, fortify ports, and monitor Ottoman advances. Each understood that the old patterns of diplomacy and trade would continue, but under the shadow of a far more dangerous an ambitious neighbor. The fall of Constantinople had altered the landscape, introducing a new variable into the 144-year struggle that would continue between Venice and the Mamluks, struggle that had begun with tariffs and imprisoned merchants, but now unfolded under the long shadow of empires rising and falling. The year 1453 was not the beginning of war, nor the end of trade disputes. It was, however, the moment when the Mediterranean world was forever changed. Venice and the Mamluks could continue their rivalry, but they now did so in a context of greater danger. Higher stakes and a shared recognition that the rules had shifted. The silent calculations, the careful navigation of diplomacy, and the delicate balance of power would shape every decision, every voyage, and every interaction in the decades to come. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus emerged as a jewel of strategic and economic significance, a small island whose influence far exceeded its size. For Venice, Cyprus was not merely a territory to observe. It was a vital point of connection to the Eastern trade, a link in the chain of commerce that extended from the ports of Alexandria to the Rio. The island's proximity to the Levant, its harbors, and its fertile lands made it an irresistible prize for any maritime power seeking influence over the region. Venice's interest in Cyprus, however, was far from purely imperial. It was deeply financial, tied to centuries of entanglement with the Lusignan dynasty that ruled the island. The Lusignan kings, descendants of a crusading lineage, were often dependent on Venetian support to maintain stability on their island. Venetian merchants and bankers provided credit, oversaw trade arrangements, and acted as intermediaries between the kingdom and the wider Mediterranean network. Every loan, every commercial contract, every negotiated tariff bound Cyprus closer to Venice. For the Republic, this financial entanglement was both an opportunity and a responsibility. Protecting Venetian interests on Cyprus meant safeguarding trade routes, ensuring the repayment of loans, and preserving access to sugar, timber, and other local resources critical to the Venetian economy. Yet Venice's influence on Cyprus was never absolute. The Lusignan kings, though dependent on external support, retained autonomy and sought to balance competing powers on the island. This created a dynamic environment in which Venetian and Mamluk ambitions intersected unpredictably. The Mamluks claimed suzerainty over Cyprus, citing historical authority and the island's proximity to their territories in the Levant. While their control was more theoretical than practical, it nevertheless provided a framework for intervention. The Sultanate could pressure Lusignan rulers, levy threats, and influence local affairs in ways that complicated Venetian plans. Cyprus, therefore, was a microcosm of the broader Mediterranean contest. Overlapping claims, intertwined economies, and fragile alliances creating constant tension. Cypriot internal politics added another layer of complexity. The island was far from stable. Noble factions vied for influence. Local populations chafed under foreign taxation, and the Lusignan monarchy often struggled to enforce its authority. Each crisis on Cyprus, whether a rebellion, a succession dispute, or a financial default, afforded an opening for external powers. Venice, ever attentive, sought to protect its commercial and political interests by intervening diplomatically, financially, and occasionally militarily. The Mamluks, observing from afar, weighed the opportunity to assert their theoretical claims, influence succession disputes, or leverage tensions to extract concessions from Venice. In Cyprus, local instability became a stage upon which Mediterranean rivalries played out with extraordinary intensity. Venice's financial involvement on Cyprus often dictated its approach to diplomacy. The Republic was deeply invested in the Lusignan monarchy, and the failure of a king to repay debts or maintain order could have consequences for Venetian merchants, ship owners, and bankers. This investment was not abstract. It was measured in silver, in ships dispatched to enforce contracts, and in years of accumulated credit extended to the island's rulers. Every loan created leverage, but also responsibility. Venice could demand compliance, but missteps could provoke local resentment, Mamluk interference, or outright rebellion. The Republic's entanglement transformed economic ties into political obligations, ensuring that Cyprus remained a constant point of tension. For the Mamluks, Cyprus represented both a threat and an opportunity. The island's proximity to their Red Sea trade routes made it strategically relevant, particularly as Venice's influence expanded. Any instability could threaten the safe passage of goods, the enforcement of tariffs, or the broader security of maritime commerce. Simultaneously, a deft intervention could assert Mamluk prestige, challenge Venetian dominance, and remind the wider Mediterranean of Cairo's reach. While the Mamluks lacked permanent military control over the island, their claims were taken seriously in diplomatic exchanges, and every Cypriot crisis was monitored with meticulous attention from Alexandria and Cairo. The island also became a flashpoint for *** naval maneuvering and show of strength. *** Venetian fleets patrolled Cypriot waters to safeguard trade and project power, while Mamluk ships, though fewer and less technologically advanced, conducted patrols, inspections, or displays of presence along the Levantine coast. Each movement carried multiple messages to local rulers, to merchants, and to the rival power across the sea. Cyprus's harbors and ports were arenas of subtle intimidation, where diplomacy, commerce, and the potential for conflict intertwined. Ships were not merely carriers of goods. They were instruments of influence, deterrence, and signaling. Their movements observed with keen interest by both Venice and the Mamluk. Succession disputes on Cyprus amplified the tension. The Lasignan monarchy often faced challenges from within its own nobility, with rival factions seeking to influence the choice of king or regent. Venice invested financially and strategically, sometimes intervened discreetly, offering support to favored candidates or mediating disputes to protect trade and loans. The Mamluks, observing these interventions, had to decide whether to assert pressure, remain neutral, or exploit divisions. Each decision was fraught, as miscalculations could provoke confrontation or destabilize the delicate balance of influence on the island. Cyprus became a laboratory of Mediterranean politics, where local dynamics and international rivalry collided. The island's economic value further intensified the stakes. Sugar, produced in Cypriot plantations and exported to Venice and beyond, was a lucrative commodity, feeding both markets and profits. Timber, essential for shipbuilding, was another vital resource. Venetian merchants sought preferential access, favorable tariffs, and the assurance that production would continue uninterrupted. Every disruption, whether a local rebellion, a customs dispute, or a threat of Mamluk interference, was a potential crisis with wide-reaching implications. In Cyprus, economics and politics were inseparable, and both Venice and the Mamluks understood that influence over the island meant influence over a significant portion of Mediterranean commerce. Over decades, Cyprus became a *** mirror, reflecting the larger rivalry ***. Small-scale conflicts delayed shipments, blocked harbors, or intercepted correspondence were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of the underlying competition between Venice and the Mamluk. Each power sought advantage without provoking outright war, balancing assertiveness with caution, yet the pressure was constant. The island's instability meant that even minor miscalculations could escalate, drawing both powers into protracted disputes, naval maneuvers, or diplomatic crises. The fragile equilibrium of the eastern Mediterranean hinged in part on the fate of this small, but strategically crucial, island. The lessons of Cyprus were clear to both powers. For Venice, financial entanglement created both leverage and responsibility. Commercial success depended on political stability, yet intervention carried risks. For the Mamluks, theoretical suzerainty required vigilance, monitoring, and occasional action to reinforce authority. Even without permanent occupation, both powers had to navigate local factions, external pressures, and the unpredictable consequences of maritime rivalry. Cyprus, in essence, distilled the challenges of Mediterranean politics into a single, ever-present locus of tension. By the end of the 15th century, the island had become more than a point of trade or a strategic waypoint. It was a * symbol of the enduring rivalry * between Venice and the Mamluks. Each crisis, each negotiation, each naval maneuver in Cypriot waters represented broader questions of influence, authority, and survival. The events on Cyprus were a microcosm of the 144-year struggle. Overlapping claims, competing interests, fragile alliances, and the constant interplay of economics, diplomacy, and military potential. As the Republic and the Sultanate continued their contest, both powers learned that Cyprus was not simply a prize to control, but a test of skill, patience, and foresight. The island's instability required continuous attention, adaptation, and strategic thinking. For Venice, failure could disrupt trade and undermine financial networks. For the Mamluks, inaction could weaken claims and embolden rivals. Cyprus exemplified the delicate balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, where commerce, politics, and military capability intertwined, shaping the path of a rivalry that would stretch across generations. The simmering tension surrounding Cyprus, long a stage for diplomacy, intrigue, and subtle threats, finally erupted into open conflict. By the late 15th century, the fragile equilibrium between Venice and the Mamluks had collapsed, overtaken by ambition, economic necessity, and the assertion of power. The island, whose very soil had been tilled by generations of contested authority, became the battleground where theory met force, and where centuries of diplomacy could no longer contain the ambitions of empires. For the Mamluks, the decision to act was rooted in both strategy and necessity. Cyprus threatened the security of their Levantine holdings, controlled access to Red Sea trade routes, and symbolized Venetian influence extending too close to their sphere. In response, the Sultanate organized an invasion strategy carefully calculated to exploit the island's internal divisions and to project power without immediately risking prolonged occupation. Mamluk commanders considered the island's fortifications, the loyalties of local nobles, and the potential for rapid strikes against Venetian positions. Their forces were a combination of seasoned cavalry drawn from the Levant, infantry capable of siege warfare, and naval support intended to transport troops and challenge Venetian control at sea. Venice, anticipating potential aggression, had not remained idle. Reports from envoys, merchants, and scouts warned of increasing Mamluk naval activity, and the Republic prepared accordingly. Fleets were reinforced, galleys stationed strategically, and alliances with local Cypriot factions encouraged. Venetian military planners emphasized speed, maneuverability, and intelligence gathering, recognizing that the island's complex geography demanded nimble and adaptable responses. The Republic's strategy combined naval superiority with diplomatic engagement, aiming to protect both trade and political influence while containing the Mamluk threat. The first clashes, although limited in scale, set a precedent for the larger conflict. Near the northern coasts of Cyprus, Venetian galleys intercepted Mamluk transports, testing both the quality of enemy crews and the strength of their vessels. These encounters, often sudden and brutal, revealed the limitations of the Mamluk navy, while underscoring Venice's mastery of maritime tactics. Rowers synchronized to the beat of drums, cannons discharged over the waves, and boarding parties fought hand-to-hand on slippery decks. Each skirmish was not just a contest of arms, but a display of discipline, coordination, and the stakes that both powers were willing to bear to control the Eastern Mediterranean. Cypriot factions played a decisive role in the unfolding war. Local noblest merchants and influential families were forced to choose sides, weighing Venetian promises against Mamluk threats. Alliances shifted with alarming speed, sometimes determined by the potential for personal gain, other times by fear of reprisal. The Lasignan monarchy, struggling to assert authority, found itself caught between two powerful empires, trying to mediate, negotiate, and survive. In effect, Cyprus became a microcosm of Mediterranean politics, where local and global ambitions collided, and where loyalties were as fragile as the promises on which they were based. The initial Mamluk advances were cautious, but strategic. Landings occurred at lightly defended ports. Supply lines were established with precision, and scouts probed Venetian positions. At the same time, the Mamluk commanders avoided direct assaults on heavily fortified cities until sufficient intelligence and reinforcements could be brought to bear. The approach reflected centuries of military tradition, calculated aggression, careful planning, and the application of force where it could yield the greatest return with minimal risk. Each move was deliberate, designed not only to challenge Venetian dominance, but also to preserve the Sultanate's prestige in the eyes of the wider Islamic world. Venice's countermeasures were equally methodical. The Republic deployed galleys to patrol the surrounding waters, intercepting transports and asserting control over key harbors. Merchant convoys were escorted by armed vessels, and local militia forces were trained to reinforce strategic points. Venetian commanders emphasized intelligence, often employing spies and informants to track Mamluk movements, anticipate attacks, and exploit weaknesses. The combination of naval mobility, disciplined crews, and strategic foresight allowed Venice to neutralize many Mamluk initiatives, even as the broader conflict escalated. Naval engagements became the defining feature of the Cyprus War. In the waters surrounding the island, fleets maneuvered with precision, attempting to outflank, outgun, and outlast one another. Cannons roared, oars sliced through the waves, and boarding parties clashed in hand-to-hand combat. The Venetians, drawing on centuries of maritime experience, often held the advantage. Yet the Mamluks displayed remarkable adaptability, learning quickly from setbacks and refining their tactics. Each engagement, while localized, carried broader implications. Control of a harbor could disrupt trade, force a faction to reconsider loyalties, or influence negotiations far beyond the immediate battlefield. The human cost of the conflict extended beyond the soldiers and sailors. Civilians on Cyprus, farmers, artisans, merchants found their lives upended. Villages were occupied temporarily, supplies requisitioned, and towns caught in the crossfire. Letters from Venetian officials described the suffering of Cypriot inhabitants, the strain on local resources, and the constant tension that pervaded daily life. For ordinary people, the war was both distant and immediate. Battles on the coast shaped trade, food, and security, and yet their presence was inescapable, affecting livelihoods and survival. Even as the conflict intensified, both powers continued to wield diplomacy alongside force. Envoys carried messages of negotiation, sought to influence Cypriot factions, and reminded opponents of the consequences of escalation. Venice leveraged its economic entanglements, offering financial incentives to secure cooperation, while the Mamluks used threats, symbolic displays of power, and the promise of retribution to shape outcomes. In this way, the Cyprus War combined the full spectrum of Mediterranean rivalry, military engagement, economic pressure, and diplomatic maneuvering. Over time, patterns of engagement emerged. The Mamluks sought to disrupt Venetian supply lines, create uncertainty among local factions, and project authority through rapid, targeted strikes. Venice focused on maintaining secure ports, reinforcing key positions, and leveraging local support to counterbalance Mamluk pressure. The island itself, with its rugged coastline, fertile plains, and fortified cities, became both battlefield and prize, a contested space where maritime skill, military strategy, and political acumen determined the outcomes of skirmishes, occupations, and sieges. Cypriot nobles who chose sides often did so under duress. Alliances were fragile, promises of protection or reward contingent on victories that were never guaranteed. A minor defeat could provoke a realignment, shifting support from Venice to the Mamluks, or vice versa. This fluidity added a layer of unpredictability to the conflict, complicating planning for both powers. Commanders and diplomats alike had to adapt constantly, responding to shifting loyalties while pursuing long-term strategic objectives. The Cyprus War also revealed the *** limits of both powers. ***. Venice, despite naval superiority, could not control the entire coastline, nor could it dictate the decisions of all local factions. The Mamluks, despite military prowess on land and determination at sea, struggled to project sustained naval power far from their ports. Both sides were forced to operate within constraints imposed by geography, logistics, and local politics, highlighting the complexity of waging war across both land and sea in the late medieval Mediterranean. By the end of these initial campaigns, the war had transformed Cyprus into a cauldron of conflict, diplomacy, and intrigue. The island, long a point of tension, had become a theater in which Venice and the Mamluks tested not only their military capabilities but also their ability to influence populations, control trade, and assert authority. Every skirmish, landing, and negotiation carried consequences far beyond the battlefield, shaping the trajectory of the 144-year rivalry that defined the Eastern Mediterranean. The Cyprus War, though rooted in trade disputes and overlapping claims, now bore the unmistakable marks of a larger struggle. Venice and the Mamluks had transitioned from cautious rivals to active combatants, each testing the limits of the other's resolve and resources. The stakes extended beyond the island itself. The outcome would influence regional commerce, the balance of power in the Levant, and the future of Mediterranean diplomacy. Cyprus was no longer merely a prize, it was the fulcrum of a conflict that had simmered for decades and would continue to define interactions for generations. The Cyprus War, though measured in years rather than decades, brought the simmering Venice-Mamluk rivalry into sharp focus, exposing the limits and vulnerabilities of both powers. The conflict, a culmination of decades of economic competition, diplomatic maneuvering, and intermittent skirmishes, reached its denouement as the Mamluk strategy of pressure and precision bore fruit. The island, once a mosaic of competing factions, now bore the unmistakable marks of occupation, negotiation, and compromise. Cypriot resistance, while fierce in localized engagements, gradually eroded under the dual pressures of military action and strategic blockade. Venetian support, though formidable, could not overcome the Mamluk capacity to project power along the Levantine coast and disrupt supply chains. Villages loyal to Venice were threatened, harbors were harried, and key nobles found themselves forced to choose between defiance and survival. Over time, many shifted allegiance or at least neutrality, recognizing that resistance came at a cost too high to sustain. The once fragmented Lusignan monarchy struggled to maintain cohesion, with internal disputes further weakening the island's capacity to resist. Venice, confronted with the realities of prolonged engagement far from its lagoon-based security, faced difficult decisions. The Republic had invested heavily in fleets, crews, and mercantile networks to support the island, but the cost was mounting. Ships required repair, crews needed payment, and the flow of spices and sugar from the east risked disruption. Venetian leaders, weighing profit against prestige, began to explore diplomatic resolutions, seeking to preserve trade routes and mercantile privileges, even at the expense of political influence on the island. Negotiation became not an admission of defeat, but a pragmatic recognition of limits. The Mamluks, emerging militarily dominant, were not without their burdens. While the victory over Cyprus reinforced their claims, it came at a significant economic cost. Maintaining naval patrols, supplying expeditionary forces, and overseeing the contested island required substantial expenditure. Cairo and Alexandria were strained by the logistics of supporting military operations so far from the heartland, and the Sultanate faced the delicate task of consolidating gains without provoking wider European intervention. Yet in the end, the strategic victory reinforced Mamluk authority, sent a warning to Venice, and reaffirmed the Sultanate's ability to protect its interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. The war's conclusion was formalized through a series of negotiations and treaties that reflected the dual realities of Venetian dependence on trade and Mamluk control over regional sovereignty. Venice secured continued access to essential ports, the ability to maintain merchant quarters, and favorable terms for the passage of goods. In return, the Republic recognized Mamluk authority and agreed to certain limitations on military activity in the vicinity of Cyprus. The outcome, though far from absolute for either side, established a framework for coexistence in the years immediately following the conflict. Cyprus itself was left profoundly altered. The war exposed the fragility of local institutions, reshaped alliances among nobles, and imposed new obligations on the monarchy to navigate between external powers. Venetian merchants returned to their trade routes, though wary of renewed confrontation. Mamluk administrators reinforced oversight and control, ensuring that strategic gains translated into lasting influence. For the island's inhabitants, daily life slowly returned to a measure of normalcy. Though the scars of conflict, both physical and psychological, remained, the war had not only determined the balance of power, but it also left a legacy of vigilance and uncertainty that would endure for generations. Regionally, the war recalibrated political and economic dynamics, The victory bolstered the Mamluks' prestige across the Levant, demonstrating that Cairo could project power beyond its borders and defend strategic interests against a sophisticated maritime opponent. Venice, while humbled, reinforced its awareness of the importance of diplomacy, intelligence, and fleet readiness. The Republic's approach to trade evolved, incorporating lessons about risk management, alliance building, and the limitations of force when applied far from home waters. Both powers emerged from the conflict more attuned to the interplay of military, economic, and diplomatic levers in shaping outcomes. The war also had implications for broader Mediterranean politics. Neighboring states observed the conflict closely. Genoese, Ottoman, and other European powers assessed both Venetian resilience and Mamluk capability. The Cyprus War became a reference point for future engagements, illustrating the complexities of projecting influence across islands, sea lanes, and politically fragmented territories. It highlighted the necessity of balancing force with negotiation, strategy with pragmatism, and ambition with constraint. For historians and chroniclers alike, Cyprus served as an enduring example of the delicate calculus required in medieval Mediterranean geopolitics. For Venice, the Cyprus War reinforced the Republic's maritime doctrine. Control of the seas, protection of trade, and readiness to employ force were inseparable from political survival. Merchant fleets became not only instruments of commerce, but also instruments of diplomacy and coercion. The Republic refined its networks of spies, envoys, and informants, recognizing that intelligence was as crucial as artillery or rowers in shaping outcomes. At the same time, the limitations exposed by the conflict prompted investments in logistics, shipbuilding, and strategic alliances preparations that would inform future engagements in the Eastern Mediterranean. In Cairo, the Mamluks consolidated authority while remaining aware of emerging challenges. Maintaining control over Cyprus required coordination between naval forces, port authorities, and the central bureaucracy. The Sultanate had demonstrated its ability to enforce claims and project power, yet the economic and logistical strains were undeniable. Administrators documented lessons learned, ensuring that future campaigns could be executed more efficiently, while balancing internal stability and external threats. The Cyprus War became a touchstone for understanding the interplay between military ambition and economic capacity. Even as the immediate conflict ended, tensions remained under the surface. Venice and the Mamluks had tested each other's resolve, observed vulnerabilities, and learned the boundaries of power. Cyprus, though stabilized, remained a strategic pivot point, a place where future disputes could reignite if circumstances shifted. The lessons of the war were clear. Influence required more than military might. Commerce, diplomacy, and adaptability were equally vital. Both powers recognized that in the Mediterranean, no victory was permanent, and no peace guaranteed. The human dimension of the conflict cannot be overlooked. Soldiers, sailors, and civilians experienced the upheaval firsthand. Lives disrupted, trade interrupted, families displaced. Merchants counted losses in both goods and income, while nobles and administrators navigated the delicate balance of allegiance and survival. Chroniclers recorded these experiences with vivid detail, preserving accounts of bravery, negotiation, and hardship. The Cyprus War, though concluded militarily, left an enduring imprint on those who lived through it and on the collective memory of both Venice and the Mamluks. By the war's conclusion, the 15th century rivalry over Cyprus had illustrated a fundamental truth. In the Eastern Mediterranean, commerce, politics, and military action were inseparable. Venice had demonstrated its capacity for maritime resilience and strategic negotiation. The Mamluks had reinforced their regional authority while grappling with the economic costs of projection. Cyprus itself had been the crucible in which lessons were forged, rivalries intensified, and the rules of engagement for decades to come were written. The Cyprus War did not resolve the broader Venice-Mamluk rivalry. It merely shifted the terms, revealing vulnerabilities, recalibrating strategies, and leaving both powers more aware of the stakes that would continue to define their interactions. It underscored the complexity of medieval Mediterranean conflict, where islands could become epicenters of power, trade routes, determined strategic decisions, and the delicate balance between diplomacy and force governed the fates of states and peoples alike. As Venice and the Mamluks emerged from this phase, both powers prepared for a world in which the eastern Mediterranean remained a contested space, marked by economic opportunity, political intrigue, and the persistent risk of renewed conflict. Cyprus had been the flashpoint, but it was only one of many arenas in a rivalry that would stretch across decades, shaped by trade, ambition, and the constant interplay of force and negotiation. While wars, treaties, and political maneuvering often dominate the chronicles of history, the Mediterranean rivalry between Venice and the Mamluks left its deepest imprint on the lives of ordinary people. Sailors, merchants, craftsmen, and caravan workers carried the weight of conflict with each journey, each ledger entry, and each crossing of the sea. Their experiences reveal the human dimension of a struggle, often recounted in terms of fleets and armies, reminding us that history is not only shaped by rulers, but by those whose labor sustains the machinery of commerce and survival. Venetian sailors, for instance, navigated the waters of the eastern Mediterranean with a constant awareness of danger. Every voyage to Alexandria or Beirut was fraught with uncertainty, as letters from captains reveal. Storms were only one threat, the potential for interception by Mamluk patrols, pirate bands, or rival merchants was always present. Ships carried spices, silks, and sugar commodities. More precious than gold, and any loss was devastating not only to profit margins, but to the livelihoods of entire crews. Rowers worked tirelessly, sometimes in chains, as the hulls of galleys strained against the currents, while lookouts scanned the horizon for the glint of enemy sails. Their letters home, sparse and careful, often conveyed anxiety beneath measured reports of safe passage or successful landings. Merchants shared the burden, negotiating not only prices, but the safety of their goods. Venetian merchants in Cairo, Damascus, and Alexandria lived in quarters designated for foreigners, where surveillance, customs, inspections, and intermittent threats shaped daily life. Their letters recount negotiations with Mamluk officials over tariffs, fines, and the occasional imprisonment of a fellow trader. Each encounter demanded patience, tact, and a willingness to operate within a system that was at once bureaucratic, unpredictable, and heavily influenced by political shifts thousands of miles away. Merchants became diplomats in miniature, balancing the pursuit of profit with the ever-present necessity of survival. Craftsmen, too, felt the ripple effects of this prolonged rivalry. Shipwrights in Venice labored to maintain and expand the fleet, their workshops filled with the scent of resin, timber, and metal. Every galley repaired or built was a response to both commercial demand and the latent threat of confrontation. Blacksmiths forged anchors, nails, and weaponry, while sailmakers and rope makers worked to ensure that Venice's fleet could continue to project influence across contested waters. In Cairo, craftsmen were similarly engaged, supplying the infrastructure for trade, fortifications, and naval operations. Their labor sustained not only local economies, but the broader strategic ambitions of the Sultanate. Caravan workers, who transported goods across deserts and mountain passes between Alexandria, Damascus, and the Red Sea ports, experienced tension in different ways. Their routes, sometimes measured in months, passed through contested territories where local taxation or Mamluk patrols could disrupt progress. Letters and accounts describe the anxiety of merchants entrusting valuable cargo to camel trains, the reliance on guides familiar with shifting political loyalties, and the careful timing required to avoid delays or interception. These workers were the invisible connective tissue of Mediterranean commerce, ensuring that spices, sugar, and silks flowed despite the pressures of war and rivalry. Markets in Cairo adapted to these conditions. Merchants displayed goods while remaining attentive to the scrutiny of Mamluk officials. Prices fluctuated in response to disruptions in shipping, embargoes, or the arrival of Venetian convoys. Chroniclers noted that the spice trade, while lucrative, became unpredictable, with some commodities vanishing from the market temporarily due to interrupted supply lines. Merchants developed networks of trust, informal contracts, and contingency plans to navigate the constant uncertainty. The market itself became a microcosm of the broader rivalry, a place where commerce, diplomacy, and vigilance intersected daily. Venetian convoys, moving across the Mediterranean, carried not only merchandise, but also a psychological burden. Crews were often armed, and convoys were accompanied by military escorts, reflecting the risks of interception or piracy. Every port call required negotiation with local authorities, adherence to tariffs, and careful observation of political currents. Failure could mean capture, ransom, or the loss of goods. Letters from merchants indicate the stress of these journeys, the anxiety of approaching Alexandria, the relief of successful passage, and the constant calculation of risk versus reward. Life at sea was a test of endurance, skill, and composure under pressure. Human stories pepper the chronicles of this era. One Venetian merchant wrote of his journey along the Levantine coast, describing a sudden storm that scattered his convoy, forcing him to seek shelter in a harbor under Mamluk oversight. He recounts negotiating safe passage for his cargo, arranging a bribe for harbor officials, and the relief of eventually reaching Cyprus. Another letter details a Mamluk caravan worker's trek across the Sinai Desert, carrying spices for export, navigating both natural hazards and the uncertainties of local authorities. These accounts, while personal, illuminate the broader context. That commerce and conflict were inseparable, and that survival required constant negotiation with forces both natural and human. Even within cities, the rivalry shaped daily rhythms. Venetian merchant quarters in Cairo and Alexandria became hubs of information exchange, gossip, and strategy. Knowledge of shipping schedules, the arrival of Mamluk patrols, and the movements of rival traders was as vital as gold. In Venice, families awaited news from the east with apprehension, knowing that delays or losses could imperil fortunes accumulated over generations. Craft guilds, shipping companies, and merchant families intertwined in networks of support and accountability, each playing a role in sustaining commerce amidst tension. Cultural and social adaptations also occurred. Both Venetian and Mamluk societies developed protocols for handling disputes, managing foreign presences, and integrating commercial imperatives into broader governance. Mamluk officials relied on interpreters, scribes, and diplomatic intermediaries to maintain order while protecting the Sultanate's interests. Venetians, aware of these structures, learned to navigate the complex hierarchies, cultivating relationships with influential figures to secure smoother transactions. Trade became an art as much as a science, requiring both knowledge of markets and an understanding of human behavior. The cumulative effect of these pressures, over decades, shaped resilience. Sailors honed their skills, learning to read winds and currents with precision. Merchants developed acumen and negotiation, risk assessment, and contingency planning. Craftsmen refined techniques to support fleets and fortifications, often innovating to meet the demands of an evolving geopolitical landscape. Caravan workers mastered the routes and the social networks necessary to transport goods safely. Each individual, through labor, ingenuity, and perseverance, contributed to the endurance of Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate across a century of tension. Yet beneath the routines of commerce and daily life, the *** shadow of rivalry remained constant. Stories of captured ships, delayed convoys, or detained merchants circulated like warnings. Gossip of negotiations in Cairo, strategic meetings in Venice, or naval maneuvers in Cypriot waters filtered down to those whose work depended on stability. People adapted, but they also feared, always aware that a sudden escalation could disrupt the delicate equilibrium on which their lives depended. In essence, the Venice-Mamluk rivalry was as much a story of human endurance as it was a tale of empires. Sailors endured storms and ambushes. Merchants navigated bureaucracies, bribes, and uncertainty. Craftsmen labored tirelessly to maintain fleets that protected commerce. Caravan workers crossed deserts under constant threat, and through it all, ordinary people maintained the machinery of trade, enabling the exchange of spices, sugar, and silks that sustained wealth, power, and the broader Mediterranean economy. By observing these lives, we understand the *** true cost of prolonged rivalry ***. It was not only measured in tariffs, naval clashes, or diplomatic letters. It was measured in the sleepless nights of a merchant awaiting a convoy, the weary arms of rowers steering galleys through contested waters, the anxious calculations of caravan workers navigating deserts, and the tension-filled marketplaces of Cairo. These experiences, often overlooked in grand histories, formed the live-in reality of a Mediterranean shaped by 144 years of contestation. The Venice-Mamluk rivalry, seen through the lens of human experience, reveals a world of constant negotiation between profit and survival, between ambition and caution, and between commerce and conflict. It is a story in which the ordinary sailors, merchants, craftsmen, and caravan workers becomes extraordinary. Their endurance and ingenuity sustaining the machinery of empires, trade, and diplomacy across decades. Their lives were the rhythm to which history unfolded, the heartbeat beneath the fleets, the markets, and the treaties that defined the Eastern Mediterranean. As the 15th century unfolded, the Mediterranean, long dominated by Venetian commerce and Mamluk control of the Levant, began to witness the rise of a new and formidable power, the Ottoman Empire. From the hills and plains of Anatolia, the Ottomans expanded relentlessly, consolidating territories, absorbing rival principalities, and cultivating a reputation for disciplined armies and innovative administration. For both Venice and the Mamluks, the Ottoman advance introduced an unsettling uncertainty, altering calculations, alliances, and the very nature of regional rivalry. The news of Ottoman victories traveled quickly through Venetian and Mamluk channels, carried by envoys, merchants, and spies. Courts in Cairo and Venice were abuzz with reports of fortified towns falling, armies advancing, and the expansion of Ottoman influence into the Balkans and Anatolia. Each report carried strategic implications. A victory in the Balkans could threaten Venetian trade routes. The absorption of neighboring states might redirect Ottoman ambitions toward the Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans were not merely expanding geographically. They were asserting themselves as a power capable of challenging both established empires and centuries-old trade networks. For Venice, the rise of the Ottomans was particularly alarming. The Republic's strength lay in its mastery of the seas and the security of its maritime trade routes. The appearance of a disciplined Ottoman navy, capable of projecting power along the Aegean and into the Eastern Mediterranean, introduced a new and immediate threat. Venetian leaders assessed the potential for Ottoman intervention in Cyprus, Crete, and other strategic islands, recognizing that control of these territories was central not only to commerce but to political influence. Intelligence networks were expanded, spies dispatched to observe Ottoman shipbuilding, and diplomatic overtures considered to mitigate the looming threat. The seas, once dominated by Venetian galleys, were becoming contested waters once more. The Mamluks, too, viewed Ottoman expansion with a mixture of apprehension and pragmatism. Cairo, long accustomed to projecting influence across the Levant and Red Sea, suddenly faced a neighbor whose ambitions could not be ignored. The Ottoman military machine comprising disciplined infantry, formidable cavalry, and growing artillery capabilities represented a challenge that was both immediate and potentially existential. In addition to territorial threats, the Ottomans threatened trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and the delicate balance of power that had allowed the Mamluks to flourish. In short, the Mediterranean rivalry that had consumed decades was now overshadowed by a power whose growth was relentless and unbound by precedent. The Battle of Varna in 1444, a pivotal confrontation in the Balkans, reverberated across both Venetian and Mamluk courts. Reports of the Ottoman victory over a coalition of European forces reached Cairo and Venice with a chilling resonance. For Venetian strategists, Varna was a stark reminder of the effectiveness of Ottoman military organization and the potential risks to maritime trade routes. The empire turned its focus southward. For the Mamluks, the defeat of European forces underscored the Ottomans' growing influence, reinforcing the need to monitor and potentially accommodate a power whose expansion could no longer be ignored. The reverberations of Varna extended far beyond Europe, shaping policies, alliances, and calculations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. In response, both Venice and the Mamluks attempted to stabilize their own relations, at least temporarily, in recognition of the shared Ottoman threat. Diplomats carried messages emphasizing trade continuity, mutual respect, and the benefits of cooperation in the face of a rising power. Treaties were discussed, Minor conflicts de-escalated, and channels of communication maintained, while the underlying rivalry between Venice and the Mamluks did not disappear. There emerged a pragmatic recognition that unilateral action could prove disastrous in a landscape increasingly dominated by the Ottomans. Venice and Cairo, in these moments, acknowledged a new reality. The Mediterranean would no longer be a theater of bilateral competition alone. The fear of Ottoman naval growth was particularly acute. Reports from Venetian spies described the construction of warships in Anatolian ports, innovations in gunnery, and the expansion of fleets capable of challenging Venetian supremacy. Mamluk intelligence, meanwhile, monitored the development of artillery-equipped galleys and the fortification of key Ottoman harbors. Both powers understood that a robust Ottoman navy could disrupt trade, project force into the eastern Mediterranean, and challenge long-established commercial and political networks. Naval preparation became a priority. Venice reinforced its galleys. Mamluks sought to expand maritime capabilities, despite technological limitations, and both powers calculated the risks of future confrontation with a state that seemed to defy precedent. Within this climate, Cyprus and other contested territories gained renewed importance. The island, which had already been a flashpoint in the Venice-Mamluk rivalry, now assumed additional strategic significance as a potential buffer against Ottoman expansion. Venetian leaders redoubled efforts to secure loyalty among Cypriot factions, maintain fortifications, and ensure rapid mobilization of fleets in case of Ottoman intervention. Mamluk officials, too, reassessed priorities, seeking to reinforce regional authority without overextending resources in ways that might leave them vulnerable to a far more powerful adversary. Cyprus, once a site of bilateral rivalry, became a test case for navigating a tripartite strategic environment. The human dimension of this shift in power was palpable. Merchants, sailors, and artisans who had endured decades of Venice-Mamluk tension now faced new uncertainties. Trading routes became longer, riskier, and subject to additional scrutiny. The psychological burden of an unpredictable Ottoman presence weighed heavily. From the galleys of Venice to the caravan routes of the Levant, chroniclers note the growing anxiety in marketplaces, the cautious calculation in diplomatic correspondence, and the evolving strategies of survival among ordinary people whose livelihoods depended on commerce and stability. The Mediterranean, already a complex web of human and political activity, became even more fraught with tension. Yet in these years, adaptation emerged alongside fear. Venice, leveraging centuries of maritime experience, refined convoy strategies, developed intelligence networks, and invested in fortified harbors. The Mamluks, though constrained by the limitations of their naval technology, emphasized strategic positioning, alliances with local powers, and the consolidation of coastal defenses. Both powers were learning, reacting, and adjusting to a world in which the Ottoman Empire was not a distant threat, but a force reshaping the strategic environment in real time. In essence, the rise of the Ottomans marked a asterisk turning point in the Venice-Mamluk rivalry. Asterisk. The conflict, once characterized by bilateral competition over trade, tariffs, and Cyprus, was now framed by the emergence of a third, increasingly dominant actor. Shared fears prompted temporary cooperation, cautious diplomacy, and strategic recalibration. Both Venice and Cairo understood that previous assumptions of uncontested dominance, secure trade routes, and predictable rivals no longer applied. The Mediterranean had entered a new epoch, one in which survival required foresight, flexibility, and a willingness to navigate an increasingly unpredictable balance of power. The legacy of this moment would echo throughout the remaining decades of the 144-year conflict. Venetian fleets, Mamluk administrators, and Cypriot rulers alike operated under the shadow of Ottoman expansion. Negotiations and treaties were filtered through the lens of a potential Ottoman threat. Military campaigns, previously calculated with a focus on bilateral advantage, now required consideration of a far larger, far more capable force. Cyprus, Egypt, and Venetian harbors were no longer only arenas of historic rivalry. They were strategic chess pieces in a wider, more dangerous Mediterranean game. Through letters, chronicles, and mercantile records, we glimpse the uncertainty and calculation that defined this period. Venetian merchants wrote of the need to reroute shipments or delay convoys in anticipation of Ottoman patrols. Mamluk officials debated resource allocation, fortification of ports, and the delicate balance between defense and economic necessity. Sailors, artisans, and caravan workers adjusted routines, aware that the world in which they operated was shifting beneath their feet. Life continued, as it always had, but the rhythm was now influenced by a rising empire, whose ambitions would reshape the entire eastern Mediterranean. By the end of this period, both Venice and the Mamluks had learned an essential lesson. Rivalry, while central, could no longer be their sole focus. The Ottoman threat demanded adaptation, foresight, and occasionally, uneasy cooperation. The Mediterranean was no longer simply a contested space between two powers. It had become a three-way arena, where survival, trade, and influence depended on anticipating movements far beyond one's own borders. Venice and Cairo faced a future in which their actions would be measured not only by the success of their own fleets and fleets' cargoes, but by the broader currents of power sweeping across Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Levant. The rise of the Ottomans into Sensei was not only a military or political event, it was a profound recalibration of Mediterranean reality. It forced Venice and the Mamluks to confront new limitations, reassess old assumptions, and consider alliances, both real and potential, in a world where the balance of power was increasingly fluid. The lessons learned during these decades would resonate through the remainder of the Venice-Mamluk rivalry, shaping strategies, diplomacy, and commerce, until the eventual collapse of the Mamluk Sultanate. By the dawn of the 16th century, the world beyond the Mediterranean was stirring in ways both unprecedented and unsettling. Across the Atlantic, Portuguese explorers had pierced the horizons of the Indian Ocean, navigating around Africa, mapping unfamiliar coasts, and establishing footholds in trading ports once monopolized by Muslim merchants. For the Mamluk Sultanate, whose wealth and influence rested upon the flow of spices, sugar, and other luxuries from the east, these distant developments were far from academic. They were existential. The arrival of Portuguese fleets in the Indian Ocean sent ripples along the entire Red Sea corridor. Pilots, merchants, and scribes recorded the first sightings of unfamiliar ships, armed with advanced cannon and carrying banners unknown to Levantine ports. Portuguese control of key ports along the coast of East Africa and the Indian subcontinent threatened the Mamluk monopoly on the spice trade. Cairo and Alexandria, long accustomed to collecting customs revenues and facilitating commerce to Venice and other Mediterranean powers, faced the grim possibility of sudden economic contraction. The flow of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other precious commodities, the lifeblood of the Sultanate, treasury could be diverted before it even reached the Red Sea. Mamluk administrators reacted swiftly. Letters from Cairo's chancery reveal intense debate over how to safeguard trade and respond to Portuguese intrusion. Naval expeditions were planned, albeit constrained by technological and logistical limits. Pilots familiar with the Red Sea and Indian Ocean were consulted. Local ports were reinforced, and measures were introduced to monitor incoming and outgoing vessels more closely. Yet, even as the Sultanate acted, there was a growing awareness that the global forces now encroaching on their centuries-old roots were beyond the direct control of traditional power. What had once been a localized rivalry with Venice was now intertwined with a burgeoning global network, a first taste of early modern globalization reshaping the Mediterranean and Red Sea worlds alike. Venice, ever attentive to commerce, watched these developments with a mixture of caution and calculation. The Republic's fortunes depended not only on trade across the Mediterranean, but also on uninterrupted access to Eastern goods. Portuguese disruption of the Indian Ocean trade posed a dual threat: scarcity of commodities that fueled Venice's economy and potential shifts in geopolitical balances. New powers asserted themselves in the East. Behind closed doors, Venetian diplomats and merchants quietly encouraged Mamluk resistance to Portuguese expansion, offering advice, intelligence, and subtle support, all while preserving the appearance of neutrality. In this way, Venice sought to safeguard its own economic interests, without overtly antagonizing the increasingly capable Portuguese. The crisis illuminated the fragility of older systems. For centuries, the Mamluks had relied on control of ports, caravan routes, and local intermediaries to maintain dominance over the spice trade. Now, the distant arrival of heavily armed foreign fleets challenged those assumptions. The routes that had once been predictable were no longer secure. Sailors and caravan workers faced new dangers on traditional paths. Merchants negotiated under the shadow of potential Portuguese, Sigier, and administrators in Cairo calculated the cost of reinforcing naval forces versus maintaining land defenses against the Ottomans or local uprisings. Every aspect of the economy, from warehouse storage to caravan logistics, required reevaluation. Cultural and diplomatic channels were tested as well. Envoys from Cairo engaged in tense negotiations with local rulers along the East African coast, attempting to assert influence over ports now under Portuguese control. Merchant intermediaries, many of whom had long-standing ties to Indian Ocean networks, found themselves navigating a new reality of foreign oversight and armed escorts. Letters from traders in Malindi Aden and Hormuz described cautious dealings, delays, and negotiations that had once been routine but now demanded careful attention to global politics. The Mediterranean was no longer a closed world. Distant continents had begun to shape outcomes in ways that previously would have seemed unimaginable. The Portuguese presence also forced strategic recalibrations for Venice. Venetian convoys, which had long sailed with confidence to Alexandria and other eastern ports, now required reconsideration. Routing, timing, and fleet composition had to account not only for Mamluk or Ottoman rivals, but also for an unfamiliar European navy operating far from Iberian shores. Venetian correspondence reveals cautious discussions over whether to seek direct engagement, maintain neutrality, or encourage proxy resistance among Mamluk forces. Diplomacy, commerce, and military planning became inseparable in this new era. For the Mamluks, the Red Sea crisis underscored a broader vulnerability. Their economic power, while formidable, was contingent on a single network of trade routes. Unlike Benicea, whose influence extended across multiple maritime theaters, the Sultanate's strength was concentrated in a region now under the threat of global competition. The challenge was not merely military, but systemic, requiring adjustments in administration, port control, caravan protection, and revenue collection. Chroniclers in Cairo describe a tense sense of anticipation, a recognition that the forces of globalization, Portuguese ships, Indian Ocean commerce, and European ambition were reshaping the very foundations of Mamluk power. The human dimension of this period was immediate and palpable. Caravan leaders, port officials, and ship crews all faced increased pressure. Merchants carried cargoes under the shadow of potential interception, while laborers and sailors experienced longer hours, heightened vigilance, and the constant uncertainty of distant threats. Daily life in Alexandria, Cairo, and other key hubs became intertwined with global developments. Hundreds or even thousands of miles away, the spice trade, which had once been a local and regional enterprise, was now a microcosm of a rapidly expanding world economy. This period also revealed the adaptive capacities of both Venice and the Mamluk. The Sultanate sought to reinforce the Red Sea with patrols, galleys, and new administrative oversight, even as Portuguese ships appeared on the horizon. Venice, meanwhile, used its intelligence networks, merchant influence, and diplomatic channels to bolster Mamluk resilience, preserving trade flows without direct confrontation. The crisis demonstrated the emergence of a new pattern in Mediterranean politics. Local rivalries increasingly intersected with global movements, and the fates of distant empires could hinge on the actions of a single fleet crossing unfamiliar waters. The Red Sea crisis thus stands as a turning point, a moment when centuries of Mediterranean rivalry were suddenly influenced by forces far beyond the traditional sphere of Venice and the Mon. What had once been a predictable contest over trade, Cyprus, and the Levant, now became entangled with global exploration. Emerging European naval power, and the early stirrings of globalization. Venice and Cairo, long accustomed to negotiating directly with one another, now had to navigate a world in which distant empires and oceanic commerce could dramatically alter outcomes. Through merchant accounts, diplomati correspondenze, and chronicles from both Venice and Cairo, we witness a world in transition. The Mamluks, defending their monopoly over spices and sugar, faced challenges unlike any before. Venice, reliant on those same commodities, quietly maneuvered to protect its interests. Sailors, caravan workers, and merchants, all participants in a centuries-old system of trade now, found their labor intersecting with global forces that would reshape the Mediterranean economy for generations. In essence, the Red Sea crisis reveals the broader arc of history. That local conflicts, however long and protracted, are never isolated. The rivalry between Venice and the Mamluks, already spanning decades, was now refracted through the prism of global change. The Portuguese arrival in the Indian Ocean reminded both powers that the Mediterranean, while central to their ambitions, was increasingly part of a larger, interconnected world. In this new landscape, success required not only skill, discipline, and diplomacy, but also the foresight to navigate a rapidly expanding global stage. The crisis also foreshadowed future developments. The eventual arrival of the Ottomans into the Red Sea, combined with the growing presence of European naval powers, would place even greater pressure on Mamluk trade routes and Venetian ambitions. The seeds of transformation, sown in the waters of the Red Sea during this period, would influence the final decades of the Venice-Mamluk rivalry, reshaping political calculations, economic priorities, and strategic planning across the eastern Mediterranean. In the shadow of Portuguese expansion and the Red Sea crises, Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate found themselves facing a dilemma that was at once urgent and unprecedented. For centuries, rivalry had defined their interactions. Constant negotiation between commerce, military posturing, and diplomacy. Yet now, with foreign fleets appearing in the Indian Ocean and the flow of spices threatened, a rare convergence of interests forced both powers to consider cooperation. The attempt at a fragile alliance would illuminate both the possibilities and limits of pragmatism in a world shaped by centuries of mistrust. The first signs of this diplomatic overture were subtle. Venetian envoys carried letters of cautious inquiry to Cairo, expressing concern over Portuguese encroachment and proposing mutual vigilance. These were not overt declarations of friendship, nor were they unambiguous in tone. The letters emphasized shared interests, the preservation of trade routes, protection of merchants, and the maintenance of Mediterranean stability, while carefully avoiding any language that might suggest subordination or a compromise of Venice's long-standing commercial privileges. They were measured, deliberate, and steeped in the art of negotiation that had guided the Republic for generations. Cairo responded with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. The Mamluk court, acutely aware of Venice's historical assertiveness, weighed the benefits of collaboration against the risk of appearing dependent on a Christian power. Letters from the Sultanate's chancery articulate a clear understanding. Venice's fleets could be a valuable deterrent against Portuguese encroachment, but Venice itself remained a competitor, always capable of leveraging trade pressure for advantage. Diplomats advised caution, recommending temporary measures of coordination without creating long-term entanglements. Trust, forged over decades of rivalry, was thin, yet necessity demanded that both sides explore the possibility of joint action. The practical manifestation of this tentative alliance took shape in a series of coordinated efforts to monitor and obstruct Portuguese movements in the Red Sea and surrounding waters. Venetian convoys were rerouted, sometimes delaying shipments to avoid confrontation, while Mamluk patrols intensified along the Red Sea coast. Dispatches reveal exchanges of intelligence, with Venetian agents sharing information on Portuguese ship movements, while Mamluk scribes provided data on local currents, harbors, and supply points. This collaboration, though limited in scope, marked a significant departure from the zero-sum competition that had defined previous decades. The partnership was rooted not in trust, but in a shared recognition of existential threat. Yet the alliance remained fragile. The weight of history, the accumulation of mistrust, betrayals, and intermittent hostilities could never be entirely erased. Venetian merchants remained vigilant, wary of potential overreach by Mamluk officials in ports, and Mamluk administrators monitored Venetian activities with equal care. Letters from Cairo remind readers that any cooperation was provisional, contingent on immediate necessity rather than a genuine reconciliation of interests. Mutual suspicion lingered like a shadow, shaping every joint action and diplomatic exchange. Despite these tensions, the temporary unity yielded concrete results. Portuguese plans encountered delays, ambushes, or logistical complications, as the combined awareness and vigilance of Venice and Cairo increased the risks of unchecked expansion. Merchant records indicate that some spice shipments were preserved, caravans protected, and key ports maintained under surveillance. The alliance, though precarious, allowed both powers to navigate the immediate crisis with greater confidence than either could have achieved alone. It was a union born of desperation, a fleeting convergence of self-interest, rather than genuine camaraderie. The human dimension of this fragile alliance is striking. Venetian sailors in Mamluk crews, previously accustomed to viewing one another with suspicion, found themselves indirectly cooperating, adjusting routes, sharing intelligence, or respecting territorial controls for the sake of survival. Merchants benefited from improved security for their cargoes, while administrators gained a measure of predictability in an otherwise volatile environment. Yet even in these moments, anxiety persisted. A single miscommunication, a delayed convoy, or a misread signal could unravel the delicate arrangements painstakingly cultivated through letters, envoys, and informal understandings. Diplomacy at this juncture was an intricate balancing act. Venetian envoys employed subtle flattery, careful phrasing, and strategic concessions, ensuring that Mamluk officials understood both the limits and potential of Venetian support. Mamluk scribes, in turn, maintained a disciplined approach, offering measured cooperation while emphasizing authority and control. Every prasse, every document, and every handshake carried layers of meaning, reflecting centuries of rivalry now tempered by necessity. It was diplomacy as performance, a negotiation of appearances, power, and survival, unfolding against the backdrop of a rapidly changing global order. The fragility of the alliance was further reinforced by the broader geopolitical environment. Portuguese fleets were only one element of change. The Ottoman Empire loomed increasingly large, capable of shifting the balance of power in both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Venice and Cairo understood that cooperation could not be permanent. Circumstances could shift, threats could recede or intensify, and old rivalries could flare once the immediate danger had passed. Chroniclers note that discussions of joint action were often accompanied by reminders of prior hostilities, serving as a constant reminder that convenience, not friendship, was the foundation of this alliance. Economic considerations also influenced the temporary partnership. Venetian access to spices, sugar, and luxury goods depended on uninterrupted trade, while Mamluk revenues were directly tied to customs and tariffs along Red Sea routes. Failure to coordinate could result in significant losses for both powers. Letters revealed that merchants, administrators, and fleet commanders alike were acutely aware of the stakes, and every decision from convoy timing to harbor patrols was weighed in the context of both profit and security. Cooperation, even if uneasy, became a tool for preserving economic stability amid global disruption. Yet the alliance was never without tension. Reports from Venetian agents in Cairo indicate continued scrutiny, occasional arrests, and fines levied against merchants under pretext of regulation. Similarly, Mamluk officials monitored Venetian movements closely, wary of overreach or opportunistic advantage. Each side interpreted the other's actions through the lens of centuries of rivalry, resulting in a partnership that was cautious, pragmatic, and often tentative. Trust was never fully restored. Cooperation was a pragmatic response to external pressure rather than a resolution of past grievances. The fleeting nature of this alliance illustrates a broader theme in the Venice-Mamluk rivalry: the interplay between necessity and suspicion. When threatened by a common adversary, the two powers could coordinate, share intelligence, and act with shared purpose. Yet the underlying mistrust persisted, a testament to decades of competition over trade, influence, and territory. Temporary unity, in this sense, was both a survival strategy and a reminder that even the most pressing external threats could not entirely erase entrenched historical rivalries. In human terms, the fragile alliance shaped everyday life in subtle ways. Sailors adjusted routines to align with coordinated patrols. Caravan workers found temporary protection along established routes, and merchants operated under a watchful yet cooperative system of oversight. These arrangements, while practical, were permeated with tension, as every participant remained alert to the possibility that old enmities could resurface. The experience highlighted the resilience, adaptability, and cautious pragmatism of those whose lives were intertwined with centuries of Mediterranean rivalry. In conclusion, the fragile alliance between Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate represents a moment when pragmatism briefly overcame history. Coordinated efforts against Portuguese expansion preserved trade, safeguarded livelihoods, and mitigated immediate threats. Yet the underlying mistrust, forged over decades of rivalry, never fully dissipated. This temporary unity serves as a lens through which to understand the dynamics of medieval diplomacy, a world in which necessity could produce cooperation, but history, suspicion, and self-interest remain powerful undercurrents, shaping every interaction. As the 16th century progressed, both Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate began to exhibit signs of exhaustion. What had once been a rivalry driven by competition, ambition, and commerce gradually gave way to fatigue political, economic, and social. For centuries, both powers had invested immense resources in defending interests, building fleets, negotiating treaties, and navigating diplomacy. Now, under the weight of decades of tension, internal decay set in, eroding the stability that had once allowed them to dominate the eastern Mediterranean. In Venice, the strain was visible in both governance and finance. The oligarchic republic, long celebrated for its disciplined bureaucracy and mastery of maritime commerce, faced internal divisions within the ruling councils. Wealthy merchant families jostled for influence, balancing commercial priorities against strategic imperatives. Chroniclers describe intense debates over fleet maintenance, convoy funding, and the allocation of resources to distant posts. Some families, having amassed fortune through decades of Eastern trade, began to prioritize private gain over state security, creating fissures in what had once been a unified governing structure. Economic strain compounded these political pressures. Venetian trade continued to thrive, but the cost of maintaining fleets, fortifying ports, and defending convoys increased exponentially in the face of new threats: Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean, Ottoman expansion, and intermittent tensions. With the Republic found itself stretched thin, forced to make hard choices, invest in distant operations, and risk local instability, or concentrate on protecting core territories and trade hubs. Letters from merchants and fleet commanders reveal frustration, as the ideal of Venetian control over Eastern commerce collided with the harsh realities of logistics, finance, and manpower. Corruption and inefficiency, while always present to some degree, became more pronounced under these strains. Officials occasionally delayed convoy departures, mismanaged tariffs, or favored private interests over the collective good. Chroniclers lamented that Venice's famed discipline was fraying, that centuries of experience could not fully compensate for human weakness. Yet even amid these challenges, Venice retained a remarkable resilience. Fleet discipline, maritime knowledge, and commercial networks allowed the Republic to remain a formidable presence, even as cracks in the system became apparent. The Mamluk Sultanate, by contrast, faced even more acute internal pressures. The Sultanate's military structure, built upon the loyalty and discipline of slave soldiers, was increasingly vulnerable to factionalism. Competing Mamluk factions vied for influence over the Sultan, the bureaucracy, and the military apparatus. Chroniclers note palace intrigue, sudden changes in command, and periodic purges that destabilized governance. The concentration of power in the hands of military elites, once a strength, became a source of fragility. Decisions were often delayed, contradictory, or shaped by personal rivalry rather than strategic necessity. Economic pressures mirrored these political difficulties. The Mamluk monopoly over the spice trade, sugar, and Eastern luxuries was eroding, threatened not only by Portuguese incursions into the Indian Ocean, but also by internal mismanagement and corruption. Customs revenues fluctuated, markets became less predictable, and caravan routes were increasingly perilous. Merchants faced higher tariffs, bureaucratic delays, and occasional confiscation of goods, while the Sultanate's treasury struggled to maintain both civilian infrastructure and military readiness. Chroniclers frequently note the tension between the needs of administration and the declining capacity of the state to meet them. Diplomacy, too, suffered. Venice and Cairo, once engaged in intricate negotiations and careful balancing acts, found their influence waning. Envoys were delayed. Treaties became difficult to enforce, and the mechanisms that had once maintained a fragile equilibrium grew unreliable. The Mamluks were increasingly preoccupied with internal power struggles, leaving less attention for foreign affairs, while Venetian leadership wrestled with multiple external threats and domestic factions, communication, negotiation, and enforcement toll. The tools that had sustained the Venice-Mamluk relationship were compromised by the pressures of decay. Ottoman pressure intensified during this period, further accelerating the decline. The Ottoman Empire, expanding in both Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, increasingly encroached upon Mamluk territory. Northern Syria, coastal cities, and strategic trade hubs became points of negotiation, contention, and eventual confrontation. Venetian leaders, observing these developments, recognized that the balance of power was shifting in ways that no temporary alliance, fleet mobilization, or trade negotiation could fully counter. The Ottomans were no longer a distant presence. They were an immediate strategic reality, challenging both Venetian influence and Mamluk authority. The human consequences of this decay were profound. Merchants, sailors, and caravan workers already accustomed to the pressures of conflict faced heightened uncertainty. Trade routes became unpredictable. Convoys risked capture or delay, and salaries or profits could no longer be counted on. Artisans and shipwrights in both Venice and Mamluk ports worked under increased pressure, often with diminished resources, as political instability and economic strain limited supplies, labor, and oversight. The lived experience of ordinary people reflected the systemic vulnerabilities of their societies, illustrating how the decay of empires permeates every level of life. Cultural accounts from the period underscore the sense of precariousness. Venetian chronicles speak of anxiety in the council chambers, debates over declining influence in the Levant, and the fear that centuries of careful investment and trade could be undermined by forces both distant and immediate. Mamluk chroniclers similarly note the erosion of authority, the unpredictability of subordinate governors, and the growing fear that external pressures, particularly from the Ottomans and Portuguese, could exploit internal weakness. Across both societies, there was a sense that a once stable world was slipping from their control, that centuries of rivalry had weakened them even as new challenges emerged. Yet even amid decline, there remained resilience. Venice maintained fleets, adapted trade strategies, and leveraged diplomatic channels to mitigate losses. The Mamluks continued to patrol Red Sea routes, administer markets, and project authority along key corridors. The decay was gradual, punctuated by moments of competence, foresight, and temporary stabilization. It was not immediate collapse, but a slow erosion of institutional strength and strategic capacity, creating a historical tension. Both powers were still formidable, yet increasingly vulnerable to forces they could not fully control. This period, which we might term the asterisk, final decay, of the Venice-Mamluk dynamic, set the stage for the concluding phases of the rivalry. Internal instability, economic strain, and weakening diplomacy left both powers exposed. External threats, especially from the Ottomans, loomed larger, and the structures that had once ensured the endurance of Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate were fraying. The Mediterranean, which had been a theater of sustained rivalry for over a century, was entering its final act, a period in which survival would hinge on adaptation, resourcefulness, and the capacity to respond to forces far larger than either state. In human terms, this decay manifested in anxiety, improvisation, and resilience under pressure. Merchants and sailors adjusted to unpredictable conditions. Officials navigated bureaucratic inefficiencies, and artisans labored to sustain fleets and fortifications with diminishing resources. The lived experience of this period reflects a broader historical truth. The strength of empires is inseparable from the capacity of their institutions to endure stress, adapt to new challenges, and manage both internal and external pressures. Venice and the Mamluks, for all their previous mastery of commerce and diplomacy, were now facing the ultimate test of endurance. Ultimately, the final decay represents both an ending and a transition. It is the erosion of long-established structures, the weakening of influence, and the fraying of diplomacy. Yet, it is also a prelude, a stage setting for the dramatic consequences that would follow. the Ottoman Conquest, the collapse of the Mamluk Sultanate, and the final transformation of Mediterranean trade and power networks. This was not the end of life in Venice or Cairo, but the final chapter of a centuries-long rivalry whose roots, ramifications, and lessons would echo far beyond the lifetimes of those who lived it. By the early 16th century, the Mamluk Sultanate, already weakened by decades of internal decay and external pressures, faced a challenge that would prove insurmountable. The Ottoman Empire, having consolidated power in Anatolia and the Balkans, now turned its attention southward. For centuries, the Mamluks had commanded respect as rulers of Egypt and Syria, guardians of the Red Sea trade, and arbiters of pilgrimage routes. Yet in 1516, the Syrian campaign launched by Sultan Selim marked the beginning of the end campaign that would dismantle the Mamluk state and reshape the eastern Mediterranean forever. The first phase unfolded across Syria, a region that had long served as the Mamluks' northern bulwark. Ottoman forces, disciplined, numerically superior, and equipped with artillery, advanced through Aleppo, Damascus, and surrounding territories with remarkable speed and precision. Chroniclers from both sides provide vivid accounts. Mamluk cavalry, renowned for skill and courage, faced Ottoman janissaries and gunpowder artillery, a combination that exposed the limits of traditional military tactics. Battles were fought with intensity and courage, but Mamluk forces, plagued by internal divisions and outdated organization, were unable to mount a sustained defense. The fall of Aleppo and the advance toward Damascus shattered the perception of Mamluk invincibility, demonstrating how centuries of rivalry, fatigue, and decay had left the Sultanate vulnerable to a new kind of warfare. Damascus fell swiftly. Ottoman artillery breached city walls, while elite troops secured key gates and administrative centers. The Mamluk governor and his retainers attempted negotiations, seeking to preserve life and property in the face of overwhelming force. Yet the momentum of the Ottoman campaign was relentless. Chroniclers note the despair of citizens witnessing the arrival of disciplined armies, the rumbling of cannon, and the displacement of traditional power structures. The city, long a hub of trade, culture, and Mamluk authority, was now a waypoint in the final Ottoman advance, signaling to the broader region that resistance, however courageous, was increasingly futile. With Syria under control, the Ottomans turned their attention to Egypt, the jewel of the Mamluk Sultanate. Cairo, a city that had long been the center of administration, commerce, and religious authority, now faced an existential threat. Mamluk forces, previously stretched thin, attempted to mobilize in defense, drawing soldiers from garrisons, assembling cavalry, and fortifying approaches to the city. Yet the internal fissures within the Sultanate, factionalism among emir, competing ambitions, and the erosion of command structure undermined coordinated defense. Dispatches described confusion in camp, delayed orders, and competing loyalties, all of which contributed to the inability to effectively repel the Ottoman advance. The decisive confrontation occurred at Redania in early 1517. Ottoman forces, strategically coordinated and utilizing artillery with devastating effect, engaged Mamluk troops in open combat. Traditional cavalry charges, the hallmark of Mamluk military identity, were repeatedly disrupted by gunfire, leading to catastrophic losses. Chroniclers describe the panic among Mamluk ranks as formations collapsed, commanders fell, and the cohesion that had sustained the Sultanate for centuries disintegrated. Wheaten oars. What had once been a formidable army was reduced to scattered resistance, leaving the path to Cairo open. The fall of Cairo followed swiftly. Ottoman forces entered the city, asserting control over administration, markets, and key religious institutions. Sultan Tuman Baidua, the last effective Mamluk ruler, attempted to organize resistance. But the combined pressures of internal betrayal, military defeat, and strategic isolation rendered his efforts futile. Wittenmont, the Mamluk Sultanate, ceased to function as an independent entity, absorbed into the expanding Ottoman Empire. Cairo, once the heartbeat of Mamluk authority, became a provincial center within a larger imperial structure, its independence extinguished, its bureaucracy reconfigured, and its trade networks recalibrated under Ottoman oversight. The collapse of the Mamluk military structure was total. Elite cavalry units, once the backbone of Sultanate power, were disbanded or integrated into Ottoman forces. Administrative elites were either removed, executed, or co-opted to maintain continuity under Ottoman control. The centralized system that had allowed the Mamluks to dominate Egypt, Syria, and Red Sea commerce for centuries was dismantled, replaced by a new order oriented toward Istanbul. Chroniclers lamented the end of an era, a sultanate that had withstood European crusades. Venetian rivalry, an internal intrigue, now succumbed to a force both methodical and unprecedented in its efficiency. For Venice, the collapse of the Mamluk Sultanate represented both an opportunity and a challenge. The centuries-long rivalry with Cairo and Alexandria had structured trade, diplomacy, and military planning. With the Sultanate gone, Venice now faced the reality of negotiating with the Ottomans, a state whose ambitions were broader, more centralized, and increasingly aggressive. While the disruption of Mamluk monopoly over the Red Sea and Eastern trade might have offered short-term commercial advantage, it also introduced uncertainty. Venetian fleets and merchants had to navigate new regulations, unfamiliar bureaucrats, and the strategic priorities of a state far more powerful than its predecessor. The Mediterranean, once a theater of manageable bilateral rivalry, was now dominated by a single, expanding empire. The end of the Mamluk Sultanate also had profound economic implications. Trade routes, previously secured under centuries of Mamluk oversight, were now subject to Ottoman taxation, administration, and military protection. Caravan routes to the Red Sea were monitored by Ottoman garrisons. Ports were fortified under new command, and the once familiar dynamics of commerce shifted dramatically. For merchants in Cairo, Alexandria, Damascus, and beyond, the patterns of daily life markets, warehouses, and shipping were transformed overnight. Venetian traders had to renegotiate terms, recalibrate risk, and reassess the viability of long-established practices in this new geopolitical context. The human dimension of the conquest was stark. Soldiers, administrators, and ordinary citizens who had grown accustomed to the rhythm of Mamluk governance suddenly found themselves navigating a new imperial order. Chroniclers recount stories of displaced families, confiscated property, and sudden adjustments to taxation and authority. The collapse of a centuries-old system reverberated through every layer of society, from elite emirs to merchants, artisans, and laborers. Life was reshaped by the swift and decisive march of Ottoman power. Yet, in the broader arc of history, the fall of the Mamluks was also a moment of transition. Ottoman control of Egypt and Syria reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean trade networks. Venice, the Portuguese, and other powers were forced to recalibrate strategy, diplomacy, and commerce in light of a new hegemony. The centuries-long Venice-Mamluk rivalry, which had defined the Eastern Mediterranean for nearly a century and a half, was now resolved not through negotiation or military stalemate, but through the imposition of a far larger imperial order. The conclusion of the Ottoman-Mamluk War thus represents a dramatic turning point. The Sultanate, which had once managed the flow of wealth, religion, and diplomacy across the Levant, had succumbed to a force capable of combining military innovation, organizational discipline, and strategic foresight. For Venice, the challenge shifted from a familiar rival to an empire whose ambitions and capabilities demanded unprecedented attention. For the people of Cairo, Damascus, and beyond, the familiar rhythms of Mamluk rule were replaced by new systems of taxation, governance, and oversight. The Mediterranean, long a theater of bilateral rivalry, now entered a new age, dominated by larger, more centralized powers and globalized trade networks. In the end, the Ottoman conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate closed a chapter that had spanned generations. The rivalry that had begun over trade, territorial influence, and strategic positioning, the competition that had endured wars, treaties, negotiations, and crises, was now resolved by the emergence of a new hegemony. The Eastern Mediterranean, once the stage of Venice and Mamluk rivalry, had been irrevocably transformed, ushering in a period of centralized imperial control, new commercial arrangements, and a redefined balance of power. The fall of the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517 did not immediately bring peace or stability to Venice. Rather, it plunged the Republic into a new, uncertain world. For more than a century, Venetian strategy in the eastern Mediterranean had been built around a single, if fraught, rivalry. Venice had negotiated treaties, fortified trading posts, and maneuvered fleets to safeguard its interests against a predictable, if sometimes volatile, adversary. Now, with Cairo and Alexandria absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, the familiar contours of rivalry vanished, replaced by an empire whose ambitions, resources, and military reach dwarfed those of the Republic. Venetian envoys moved quickly to assess the situation. Letters from the Duke's Chancery describe urgent consultations, fleets in port, merchant convoys en route, and agents dispatched to Constantinople to negotiate terms with the Sultan. Venice understood that the disappearance of the Mamluk Sultanate was not merely the loss of a competitor. It was the emergence of a hegemon controlling key trade arteries, from the Levant to the Red Sea. For Venetian merchants, the consequences were immediate. Customs regimes shifted, caravan routes were altered, and the familiar mechanisms of securing eastern goods were no longer reliable. The initial negotiations were delicate. Venetian diplomats, steeped in centuries of experience, approached the Ottomans with a combination of caution, flattery, and pragmatism. Letters to Sultan Selim emphasized Venice's long history of trade, its role in stabilizing Mediterranean commerce, and the mutual benefits of cooperation. At the same time, envoys were careful to avoid language that might suggest weakness or subordination. Venice's approach reflected a fundamental principle of its diplomacy. Survival and profit depended on adaptability. Even when confronted by an empire that could dictate terms on its own, trade, the lifeblood of Venice, faced immediate disruption. The Eastern Mediterranean had long been a complex network of ports, convoys, and intermediaries, calibrated over decades to maximize efficiency and security. The sudden replacement of the Mamluk administration with Ottoman governance created uncertainty. Tariffs were recalibrated. Local authorities were unfamiliar with Venetian practices, and the protective arrangements previously negotiated with Cairo and Alexandria were no longer guaranteed. Merchants faced the risk of seizure, delay, or unexpected fines, forcing the Republic to re-examine routes, scheduling, and fleet composition. Yet Venice's response was pragmatic. Envoys sought agreements that would preserve commercial privileges, while recognizing the Ottomans' newfound authority. Venice understood that outright resistance was not an option. Fleets, however disciplined, could not challenge the Ottomans across the Levant and Red Sea. Instead, negotiation, diplomacy, and adaptation became central strategies. Venetian correspondence from this period reveals careful calculations, which ports to prioritize, which routes to avoid, and how to secure the transport of spices, sugar, and luxury goods. Under a regime unfamiliar with the delicate balances of Venetian trade networks, the disappearance of the Mamluks also carried symbolic weight. For centuries, Venice had defined itself against a particular rival, calibrating strategy, investment, and diplomacy around the predictable dynamics of the Mamluks' sudden absence created a void, not only in geopolitical terms, but in the very logic of Venice's eastern policy. Chroniclers and diplomats alike recognized the challenge. A familiar adversary had been replaced by a new, unpredictable actor with ambitions that could not be easily contained or anticipated. Venice was forced to transition from rivalry to negotiation, from competition to cautious collaboration, without precedent for guidance. Strategic adjustments were equally urgent. Venetian fleets, which had been deployed to monitor Mamluk waters and protect convoys, were recalibrated to account for Ottoman naval strength. Commanders were instructed to avoid provocation while maintaining readiness, to protect merchant vessels with minimal confrontation, and to preserve diplomatic channels. Even in the event of disputes, fortifications in key Mediterranean ports were reinforced, and intelligence networks expanded to monitor Ottoman movements, both naval and diplomatic. Venetian merchants were guided to maintain regularity in shipments, adjust timing and routes to reduce risk, and cultivate relationships with Ottoman officials who now controlled formerly Mamluk ports. Venice leveraged its long experience in negotiation, intelligence gathering, and maritime strategy to mitigate the shock of a transformed political landscape. Yet the challenges were profound. The Ottomans' approach to governance, taxation, and military oversight was unfamiliar and sometimes unpredictable, whereas the Mamluks had relied on a decentralized system with local emirs, exercising considerable autonomy. The Ottomans centralized authority, emphasizing imperial control and uniformity. This required Venice to rethink established practices, how to negotiate rights, secure trade, and anticipate regulatory changes in a system more rigid, hierarchical, and capable of rapid enforcement than the one it had previously engaged with. The economic implications were equally significant. The flow of spices, sugar, and luxury goods, a lifeline of Venice's prosperity, now depended on successful negotiation, careful scheduling, and strategic placement of fleets. Any miscalculation could lead to delays, shortages, or loss of revenue. Venice's long-term strategy had to balance immediate commercial survival with broader geopolitical awareness. How to maintain influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, preserve access to essential commodities, and avoid conflict with an empire whose capacity for military projection far exceeded that of the Mamluks. In essence, Venice confronted a new order, one in which its centuries-long rivalry had ended, not through negotiation or war, but through the emergence of a larger, more capable imperial power. The disappearance of the Mamluks required adaptation, flexibility, and foresight. Venice's response, negotiating with the Ottomans, adjusting trade networks, and reconfiguring strategy, demonstrates the resilience and pragmatism that had allowed the Republic to thrive for centuries, even as the political landscape shifted in ways that were both profound and irreversible. This period marks a transition from centuries of bilateral rivalry to a world dominated by empires capable of projecting power across vast regions. Venice's diplomacy, fleet operations, and merchant networks now operated in the shadow of Ottoman authority, requiring a blend of caution, intelligence, and adaptation. The disappearance of the Mamluk Sultanate was both the conclusion of a long-standing conflict and the beginning of a new chapter in Mediterranean geopolitics, one in which Venice's survival would depend on its ability to navigate a far larger and more complex imperial landscape. In the end, Venice confronted a reality that was both stark and transformative. The Republic, long accustomed to maneuvering around a single adversary, now faced an empire whose ambitions extended far beyond the Eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes shifted, negotiations became more complex, and the strategies that had sustained Venice for generations required adaptation. The disappearance of an old rival, the Mamluks, was both an opportunity and a challenge, compelling Venice to recalibrate its priorities, diplomacy, and maritime strategy in a world reshaped by Ottoman dominance. The year 1517 did not simply mark the fall of the Mamluk Sultanate. It heralded a transformation across the entire Mediterranean world. Trade networks that had been calibrated over centuries suddenly shifted. Merchants, administrators, and rulers alike confronted a reality they could neither ignore nor fully control. Merchants experienced a profound psychological shift. For generations, trade had been guided by an understanding of the Mamluk system. Personal relationships, informal agreements, and predictable bureaucratic rhythms. The Mediterranean was no longer merely a stage for rivalry. It had become a theater of empire, where missteps could be catastrophic. Rulers, too, experienced the impact of the Ottoman expansion. In Venice, the Doge and the Council faced strategic recalibrations. Fleets were redeployed, fortifications examined, and diplomacy refocused. Surviving documents provide a remarkable window into this period. Venetian dispatches, merchant letters, and Mamluk era chronicles all capture the disorientation and adaptation of this moment. Merchants meticulously recorded tariffs, shipment times, and Ottoman decrees. Consuls reported delays, reassessed trade routes, and described efforts to maintain influence in formerly Mamluk ports. These records revealed the daily challenges of operating within a transformed geopolitical and commercial landscape, where centuries of experience suddenly required reinterpretation and recalibration. In this period, survival and profit required flexibility, intelligence, and careful judgment, as old patterns of rivalry gave way to more complex and interdependent arrangements. Adaptation rather than dominance, became the guiding principle. In conclusion, the aftermath of the Ottoman conquest transformed both the Mediterranean and the psychology of those who operated within it. Trade routes were reshaped, diplomatic practices recalibrated, and centuries of rivalry rendered obsolete. The landscape of commerce, diplomacy, and daily life had been irrevocably altered, setting the stage for the final reflections on a struggle that spanned 144 years, shaped generations, and left a lasting imprint on the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. The 144-year rivalry between Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate left a legacy that extended far beyond the ebb and flow of fleets, convoys, and diplomatic letters. It was a struggle that shaped not only commerce and politics, but the very fabric of Mediterranean life, influencing culture, governance, and the memory of states long after the final cannon fire and treaty signatures. This legacy is complex, layered, and enduring, a testament to how protracted conflict can transform societies, economies, and identities over generations. The lessons were clear. Survival depended not only on maritime strength, but on flexible diplomacy and the ability to anticipate shifts in imperial ambition. Yet the conflict also highlighted the interdependence of seemingly opposing powers. Venice's reliance on Eastern good spices, sugar, silks, and incense had driven much of the rivalry, while the Mamluks depended on foreign merchants for customs revenue and the flow of wealth through Cairo and Alexandria. The long struggle underscored a paradox. Centuries of rivalry had forged both antagonism and collaboration. Even in the most bitter phases of confrontation, diplomacy, trade agreements, and temporary alliances had emerged out of necessity. This interdependence shaped the Mediterranean economy, forcing both sides to innovate and adapt in ways that influenced regional politics for decades. Culturally, the war facilitated exchanges that were both subtle and profound. Venetian merchants, envoys, and sailors brought back not only goods, but ideas, technologies, and artistic influences from Cairo, Alexandria, and other Mamluk cities. Architectural techniques, textile patterns, and administrative practices traveled westward, leaving imprints on Venetian art, commerce, and urban design. Similarly, Mamluk scribes, chroniclers, and administrators observed Venetian maritime practices, fleet organization, and mercantile techniques, influencing local approaches to trade, governance, and military preparedness. Conflict, it seemed, also became a conduit for learning, an indirect channel for cultural cross-pollination that would resonate long after peace had returned. Venice itself evolved into an early modern power through the pressures and lessons of this rivalry. Memory of the Mamluk-Venetian rivalry persisted in political consciousness long after the conflict ended. European chroniclers, Ottoman administrators, and later historians referenced the prolonged struggle as a cautionary tale, a narrative of commerce, ambition, and the fragile balance between rivalry and cooperation. Venice itself commemorated victories, negotiated settlements, and remembered losses, embedding the conflict into the Republic's civic identity. In the Islamic world, Mamluk chroniclers and scholars reflected on the centuries of engagement, recording both the triumphs and failures that would define their memory of regional power, trade, and diplomacy. The war, in essence, became a reference point for understanding strategy, commerce, and the dynamics of Mediterranean geopolitics. Economically, the long rivalry reshaped the flow of goods and the structure of trade networks. Mamluk controlled over the Red Sea routes, and Venice's need to access them had driven centuries of competition, negotiation, and intermittent conflict. With the Mamluk Sultanate's collapse, the Ottomans inherited these routes, introducing new regulations, taxation, and oversight. Venice had to adjust, rerouting fleets, renegotiating privileges, and developing strategies for navigating Ottoman-controlled ports. The war thus catalyzed innovations in trade logistics, convoy organization, and risk management that would serve Venetian commerce for decades to come. The conflict also had broader geopolitical consequences. Italian states, the papacy, and emerging European maritime powers observed the Venetian Mamluk struggle as a study in the intersection of commerce and military power. Lessons learned from decades of negotiation, temporary alliances, and economic warfare informed broader strategies, from naval expansion to diplomatic engagement in the Eastern Mediterranean. The rivalry exemplified how sustained conflict over trade could shape political strategy, influence alliance building, and recalibrate regional hierarchies, leaving a lasting imprint on the Mediterranean world. Venice's maritime innovations, fleet coordination, and convoy strategies evolved in response to the challenges posed by the Mamluks. Likewise, the Mamluks, while ultimately defeated by the Ottomans, demonstrated resilience in defending strategic points, organizing Red Sea patrols, and managing complex administrative and military networks. The conflict revealed the evolving nature of naval and economic warfare, illustrating how protracted rivalry could drive innovation, strategic thought, and institutional development. Finally, the legacy of the 144-year war is one of continuity and change. While the immediate rivalry ended with the Ottoman conquest and the disappearance of the Mamluk Sultanate, the structures, strategies, and memories shaped by the conflict endured. Venice retained its mercantile strength, enriched by lessons learned, while the Ottoman Empire inherited a region deeply conditioned by centuries of commerce, diplomacy, and conflict. Cultural exchange, economic innovation, and strategic adaptability born of rivalry persisted. Long after the cannons fell silent, in reflecting on this legacy, one sees a conflict that was more than battles and treaties. It was a defining epoch. It influenced the trajectories of empires, the rhythms of trade, the experience of everyday people, and the memory of generations. The war illustrates how sustained rivalry, even amid violence and mistrust, can produce enduring consequences in politics, economics, culture, and human resilience. Venice and the Mamluks, though ultimately unequal in their fates, left behind a shared history that shaped the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. The 144-year war stands as a testament to the intricate interplay of ambition, commerce, and power. It reminds us that history is rarely a single battle or treaty, but a continuum of decisions, adaptations, and human experiences. The rivalry between Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate, in all its complexity, shaped not only the course of Mediterranean politics, but the development of early modern commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Its echoes are found in the streets of Venice, the markets of Cairo and Alexandria, and in the chronicles that preserve the memory of generations who lived through decades of tension, negotiation, and transformation. In this way, the legacy of the 144-year war transcends simple chronology. It is a story of adaptation and endurance, of commerce intertwined with conflict, of human lives navigating uncertainty and opportunity. It is a reminder that rivalry can produce both destruction and creativity, and that the outcomes of sustained competition shape not only empires, but the very structures of society, economy, and culture. Venice and the Mamluks, through centuries of confrontation, left an indelible mark on the Mediterranean mark that defined the world they inhabited and the world that followed. The story of Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate is in many ways a story about human ambition, desire, and dependence. For 144 years, these two powers contended, negotiated, and collided not over mere ideology or religious fervor, but over commerce, control, and the flow of goods that shaped wealth and power across the Mediterranean. Spices, sugar, silk, and incense were not luxuries alone. They were the lifeblood of empires, the metrics of influence, and the measure of survival. This interdependence created cycles of confrontation and accommodation, tension and negotiation, mistrust and compromise, a rhythm that defined not only statecraft, but the lived experience of ordinary people along every trade route and in every port city. The long rivalry reveals much about the emergence of what historians now recognize as early modern global trade. The Venice-Mamluk conflict was not isolated. It was part of a web of interactions stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, from the Red Sea to the markets of Europe. The pressure to secure spices, the need to protect merchant convoys, and the reality of long-distance commerce pushed states to innovate. New ships, more reliable accounting, complex diplomatic protocols, and sophisticated risk management. In this way, the rivalry was not merely destructive, it catalyzed structural, technological, and economic developments that would shape global trade for centuries to come. Venice's later expansion, the Portuguese penetration of the Indian Ocean, and even Ottoman maritime policies all have roots in the interactions and conflicts of these 144 years. Yet, beyond commerce, beyond fleets and treaties, the story of Venice and the Mamluks is deeply human. Sailors braving the Mediterranean, caravan workers transporting goods across deserts, merchants negotiating under the constant threat of arrest or embargo. These individuals bore the weight of rivalry. Families depended on the flow of goods. Communities were shaped by the rhythms of trade and the proximity of conflict. Letters, chronicles, and records reveal their anxieties, their calculations, their courage. One can almost hear the pulse of their lives. The uncertainty of storms at sea, the tension at port gates, the careful tallying of profits against risks. Their endurance, day after day, decade after decade, forms the human backbone of this 144-year saga. It was not only the states that struggled, it was the ordinary people whose labor, negotiation, and resilience made the commerce and conflict possible. The Venice Mamluk story also demonstrates the complex entanglement of power, geography, and ambition. The Mediterranean, a seemingly enclosed sea, was at once a theater and a lifeline, a corridor for trade, migration, and conquest. Venice, rising from a lagoon, mastered its waters with ingenuity, discipline, and strategic foresight. The Mamluks, a military elite, transplanted from the peripheries of the Islamic world, forged control over Egypt and Syria, mastering both desert and port. Their conflict, therefore, was not abstract. It was about the control of physical space, of ports and roads, of choke points and trade arteries. Geography dictated strategy, and strategy demanded human ingenuity, endurance, and compromise. Yet the lessons of the 144-year struggle echo through both time and space. States learn to negotiate long-term dependencies, to manage economic warfare, and to calibrate diplomacy in ways that balanced ambition with pragmatism. Merchants developed skills in risk assessment, accounting, and negotiation that would underpin future global trade. Sailors and caravan workers, often invisible in grand historical narratives, demonstrated extraordinary endurance, their lives interwoven with the strategies of empires. The conflict's legacy, therefore, is not merely territorial or economic. It's also cultural, institutional, and profoundly human. Perhaps most poignantly, this rivalry illustrates how conflict and cooperation are never mutually exclusive. Venice and the Mamluks, though adversaries, were compelled into continuous negotiation, into mutual accommodation, into a shared dance of commerce and diplomacy. The irony is striking. The very mechanisms of conflict also fostered the conditions for adaptation, learning, and long-term stability in trade. But the rhythms of daily life, the flow of commerce, and the evolution of global systems, their conflict explains the birth of structures, practices, and approaches that underpin early modern trade, revealing the complex interplay of ambition, necessity, and human ingenuity. It is a story of ambition and limitation, of rivalry and dependence, of courage and calculation. It reminds us that economic necessity can drive as much action as ideology, that rivalry can coexist with cooperation, and that endurance in the face of uncertainty is a measure of both personal and societal resilience. It underscores the interconnectedness of the Mediterranean world. No state acted in isolation, no merchant moved without awareness of a broader system, and no policy could ignore the consequences of the rival it sought to constrain. The saga of 144 years teaches us about the patience, foresight, and courage required to navigate a world defined by constant flux. As we concluded, the human story shines bright. Sailors watching the horizon for storms or enemy ships, merchants tallying accounts with trembling hands, envoys negotiating tirelessly in distant courts. These individuals live through the consequences of strategy, ambition, and interdependence. Their stories, preserved in letters, chronicles, and archives, give the Venice-Mamluk rivalry its enduring power. They remind us that history is not only about empires, but about the people whose lives are intertwined with the ambitions, successes, and failures of the great powers around them. In the final reckoning, the 144-year war between Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate stands as a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and interdependence. It is a story of commerce driving conflict, of rivalry shaping cooperation, of ordinary lives bearing the weight of extraordinary ambition. It explains the origins of modern global trade, illuminates the endurance of individuals across generations, and leaves a profound emotional imprint on the history of the Mediterranean. Venice and the Mamluks, though long vanished as rivals, remain present in the legacy of their struggle. Legacy of tension and adaptation, conflict and negotiation, and ultimately, human endurance through the relentless cycles of power. The saga of 144 years ends not with a final battle, but with the enduring lessons of strategy, commerce, and resilience. It is a story of people and empires, of ambition and limitation, of rivalry and mutual dependence. And as the Mediterranean carried on, waves lapping against the docks of Venice, the markets of Alexandria, and the caravans crossing desert sands, the memory of this long struggle persisted, a reminder of the complexity, endurance, and humanity that define history itself. The war is over, but its echoes remain. It teaches us that even the longest, most arduous conflicts leave lessons beyond victory or defeat. They reveal the structures of trade, the rhythms of diplomacy, the strategies of states, and the courage of ordinary people. In this, the Venice-Mamluk rivalry is not simply history. It is a meditation on human endurance, on the interdependence of rivals, and on the shaping of a world poised on the brink of global trade and early modern transformation. The 144-year saga closes, yet its story endures, a story of ambition, resilience, commerce, and the human capacity to navigate uncertainty. Venice and the Mamluks, though long gone as adversaries, have left behind a legacy that continues to shape how we understand the Mediterranean, trade, diplomacy, and the enduring complexity of human life.